Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway station, which was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear. They were waiting for their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown caught sight of him sitting on an old suitcase behind a pile of mail bags. As they drew near, he stood up and politely raised his hat. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" "Well, no," said Mr. Brown. "We were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" "Darkest Peru," said the bear. "I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. I came all the way in a lifeboat, and I ate marmalade. Bears like marmalade. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy, but she had to go into a home for retired bears, so I emigrated." "Oh." "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough, but now that I have, I'm not quite sure what to do next." As he bent down, the Browns caught sight of a label round his neck. It said, "Please look after this bear, thank you." It was the kind of label you couldn't possibly ignore, and in no time at all, things began to happen. Mrs. Brown thought of a name for him. Paddington. And while she went off to look for Judy, Mr. Brown was put in charge of ordering some refreshments. Paddington. Paddington. "Come along, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "I expect you're hungry after your long journey." "I am," said Paddington. "Very." Paddington had never been taken out to tea before, and he was very excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who've been inside a buffet, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. No," said Mr. Brown. Especially one with buns." "I think perhaps I'd better sit down." Yes," said Mr. Brown, trying hard to pretend that he had tea with a bear every day of his life. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington as he caught sight of the others. "Don't go away. We're in here." "Watch out," shouted Mr. Brown. But he was too late. Paddington was already up to his knees in trouble. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown, "what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" "Look at him. He's all covered in jam and cream. I've never seen such a mess. I don't know what the manageress will say." "Or the taxi driver," said Judy. "Taxi driver?" "Judy's right," said Mrs. Brown. "We can't leave him here, not in his present state." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington. "I'll clear up the mess. Bears are good at clearing up messes." "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please, as quickly as you can." "Not too quickly," called Mrs. Brown. "We've 2 more to come." "Is that one of them?" asked the driver. "He's covered in white stuff." "It's only cream," said Judy. "I dare say," said the driver. "But bears is 6 pence extra." "Sticky bears is 9 pence. 9 pence extra!" exclaimed Paddington hotly. He directed a hard stare at the driver. He seemed to go a funny shade of pink. "Gosh," said Judy, "how did you learn to do that?" "My Aunt Lucy taught me," said Paddington. "She said it might come in useful one day." "Mary," said Mr. Brown, "are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "That," said Mrs. Brown, "remains to be seen. I've never had a bear about the house before, but I have a feeling things may never be quite the same again." When Paddington arrived at number 32 Windsor Gardens, the first person he met was the Browns' housekeeper. Mrs. Bird. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm from darkest Peru, and I've come to stay." "Peru!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "Good gracious, whatever next?" "Don't worry," called Judy. "He's going to have a bath. Hold on, Paddington, I'm just coming." "Did you say you're from Peru?" called Mrs. Bird. "Darkest Peru," said Paddington. "In that case, I'd best be getting some more marmalade in." "Fancy knowing I like marmalade," exclaimed Paddington. "Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything," said Judy. "She sounds just like Aunt Lucy," said Paddington. The next person Paddington met was Judy's brother Jonathan, and while Jonathan put some bubble mixture into the bath, Paddington listened carefully to his instructions. "There's some soap," said Judy, "and a towel, and a brush so that you can scrub your back." Paddington felt he would sooner just sit in a puddle, but he didn't like to say so. "It sounds very complicated," he announced. "Well," said Judy, "don't forget to wash your ears. They look very black." "Black?" said Paddington hotly. "Black?" "They're meant to be black. At least, I think they are." For a moment or two, he toyed with the idea of whitening his ears with a toothpaste, but he soon gave that up. There were other, much more interesting things to do. "What was that?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Perhaps it was Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "Bang went our tea by the sound of it." Unaware of the alarm he was causing, Paddington busied himself making a foam map of South America. Some of the mountains were very high indeed, and he was about to mark in darkest Peru when he suddenly remembered the bath. "What is going on?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Don't tell me Mrs. Bird's fallen in the washing-up water now." "That's funny," said Jonathan. "Talking of water—" "Gosh!" cried Judy. "Look!" "Paddington, he's in trouble." To say that Paddington was in trouble was to put it mildly. He tried calling out, "Help," fairly quietly, so as not to disturb anyone, and then much louder, "Help! Help!" "Paddington," said Judy, "you've still got your duffel coat on." "I didn't want to get too wet," gasped Paddington. "Only I think I have done after all." "Help!" "Why ever didn't you pull the plug out?" exclaimed Jonathan. "Pull the plug out?" repeated Paddington. "Nobody said anything about that. I shall never, ever have a bath again," he said firmly. "It's much too complicated." But before he went to bed that night, Paddington did have one more go. "It's what's known as a dry bath," he announced. "It's safer than using water, and it's much less messy." The first morning in his new home, Paddington woke to the news that Mrs. Brown and Judy were taking him for a trip on the Underground. There was also a large tray of breakfast things beside his bed. So much seemed to be happening at once, he had a job deciding what to do first. So he started on the bacon. "Hurry up," called Judy. "We're going shopping and it's nearly time to leave." "Coming," cried Paddington. "I've never been on an underground before," he announced. "I'm not sure if you'll be going now," said Judy. "Not with bacon sticking out of your suitcase like that. Look at it." "It's for emergencies," said Paddington. "Bears often have emergencies." "In fact, I think I've got one coming on now." "It's very strange," said Mrs. Brown. "I've never heard so many dogs. Perhaps it's the fine weather bringing them out." "I don't think it's the weather, Mrs. Brown," gasped Paddington. "I think it's my bacon. What's left of it." After the excitement of Windsor Gardens, Paddington found the underground much more to his liking, and he hurried on ahead of the others. Everything seemed to have been thought of. There was a moving staircase, pictures on the wall. There was even a sign with his name on, showing which way to go. "Paddington," cried Judy, "you're going the wrong way." But it was too late. By the time he'd realized his mistake, Paddington was at the top of the stairs again. "Here," said the ticket collector. "What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet." "I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom," said Paddington. "Bert," called the collector, "there's a young bear here smelling of bacon. Says he's made a mistake at the bottom." "I'm sorry," said Paddington. "I'm not used to escalators. We don't have any in Darkest Peru." "Darkest Peru?" repeated the inspector. "Oh, well, in that case, you'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any more tricks. You're worse than them dogs." "Shoo, go away." "There he goes again," cried Judy. "Do something, Paddington." "That," said Mrs. Brown, "was a dangerous thing to say. I think he's done it." "You again?" said the inspector. "I'll have you know escalators is for the convenience of passengers, not for the likes of young bears to play on." "It doesn't seem very convenient to me," said Paddington. "I've been here ages and I haven't got anywhere yet." "We're supposed to be going shopping," said Mrs. Brown. "That's as may be," said the inspector sternly, "but pressing the escalator stop button without a very good reason is against the rules. Persons are expected to abide by the rules." "Did you say persons?" asked Judy. "That's right, and I've got my job to do. It's bad enough being pestered by dogs." "Well, Paddington's not a person," said Judy. "He's a bear. Isn't that lucky?" Said the inspector. Well, don't let it happen again." "I think you're a very kind inspector," said Judy. "Don't you, Paddington?" "Very," agreed Paddington. "In fact," he announced, "I shall always travel from here in future. It's a very good station if you don't want to go anywhere, especially if you have an emergency on the way." Paddington had never been shopping in London before, especially at a store like Barkridge's. Equally, Barkridge's had never had a customer quite like Paddington, especially in the gentleman's outfitting department. "We would like some bear's pyjamas, please," said Mrs. Brown. "Bear's pyjamas," repeated the assistant. "Has Madam tried something in government surplus?" "Indeed not," said Mrs. Brown. "I've never heard anything like it. Have you, Paddington?" "Never," said Paddington hotly, and he gave the man one of his special hard stares. "Yes, sir," said the assistant. "At once, sir." "He's been sleeping in his duffel coat," explained Mrs. Brown, "and we don't want that." "We certainly don't," agreed the assistant. "Would the young gentleman care for something in stripes? They're all the rage just now." "I'd sooner have something in spots," said Paddington. "If I had a pair like these, I don't think I would ever get lost, not even if I fell out of bed by mistake." "You can say that again," murmured Judy. "The changing rooms are on the right," called the assistant. "Don't go wrong." "I do hope they fit," said Mrs. Brown. "He'll be most disappointed if they don't." "So shall we all, madam," said the assistant. So far, pyjama week at Barkridge's had been a disaster. In fact, Paddington was the first customer they'd had for days. But if Barkridge's were unhappy about their pyjamas, Paddington was even more upset by the state of their changing rooms. As far as he could make out, most of the doors were locked, and when he did find one which opened, he practically had to force his way through. On the other hand, once inside, it was all very different. It was more like the inside of a house, and he was most impressed. Paddington wasn't sure how long he slept, but he was suddenly woken by a very strange noise. It sounded just like rain, but as he looked out of the window, he had yet another shock. "Well," said a voice behind him, "what are you doing in our shop window, Bear?" "Your shop window?" repeated Paddington. He suddenly wished he hadn't bought such loud pyjamas. "Oh dear," he announced to the world in general, "I think I've been recognized." But to his surprise, the manager of Barkridge's was more than delighted with all that had happened. "Bear," he boomed, "you're what we in the trade call a trend-setter. Since you went to bed in our shop window, those pyjamas have been selling like hot cakes. Look at them. They've all gone." And to show just how pleased he was, he offered Paddington anything he liked to choose in the store as a present. Paddington licked his lips. All the excitement had made him feel hungry, and he was tempted to ask for one of the hot cakes the manager had mentioned. Then he caught sight of the very thing, some Wellington boots. "I'd like a pair of these, please," he announced. "If it rains the next time I'm in bed, it'll stop the ends of my pyjamas getting soggy. That would never do, especially now you've sold out." One of the things Paddington liked most about living with the Brown family was that he made lots of new friends. The nicest one of all was Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the Portobello Road, and most mornings they had their 11s together. What Mr. Gruber didn't know about antiques wasn't worth knowing, and to enter his shop was like entering another world. So when he arrived one morning and found that his friend appeared to be washing one of his pictures, he was most surprised. "Don't worry, Mr. Brown," explained Mr. Gruber. "I'm only restoring it." "So?" Paddington looked at it doubtfully. "It doesn't seem to be one thing or the other, Mr. Gruber," he said. "Ah," said Mr. Gruber. "There's more in paintings than meets the eye." You see, in the old days, Mr. Brown, artists were often so poor they had to do their paintings on top of old canvases. Sometimes, if you clean a painting, you find a much more valuable one underneath. Do you realize, Mr. Brown, this could be an old master? It looks more like an old mistress to me, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. Paddington turned the matter over in his mind all the way home, and by the time he reached number 32 Windsor Gardens, he was very thoughtful indeed. Mr. Brown had lots of pictures, and one of them had been standing in the front room for several days now, doing absolutely nothing. I think, he announced to the world in general, I may try restoring it for him. I expect he'll like that. Paddington had a hopeful nature, but as time went on, he began to get a bit worried. Far from being restored, Mr. Brown's picture looked as if it would never be quite the same again. Worse still, there was no sign of another painting underneath. It was, to say the least of it, a mess. It was only when he tried turning it round the other way that he discovered there was a label on the back. It said, "Property of Mr. Henry Brown, entry for the Portobello Road Art Society painting competition, to be collected." Mr. Brown's painting had started out as a study of some boats on a lake. Now it looked more like a storm at sea. Even with real paints, Paddington wouldn't have fancied his chances of repairing the damage, but with only tomato sauce and marmalade to work with, he had a nasty feeling there might well be an even bigger storm before the day was out. Paddington went to bed early that afternoon, suffering from a mysterious attack of something called restoritis. It was a most unusual complaint, which had caused him to come out in red and orange spots. If they looked suspiciously like tomato sauce and marmalade stains, he managed to hide the fact behind a large bowl of calves' foot jelly, Mrs. Bird's recipe for all ills. It wasn't until much later on, when he heard a strange voice downstairs, that he decided to put in an appearance again. "Remarkable use of colour," said the voice. "Most unusual, using marmalade chunks instead of paint." To Paddington's surprise, Mr. Brown's picture was occupying a position of honour in the middle of the room, and on the frame there was a large red rosette. "That means it's won first prize," explained Judy. "I didn't know you painted abstracts, Dad," said Jonathan. "I don't," said Mr. Brown, "but I'd like to abstract an answer from whoever did do it." "I was really looking for an old master, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, "but I'm afraid it went wrong." "It looks more like a young bear to me," said the judge. "And I'll say one thing, it not only looks good, it tastes good as well. Try some." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, "but I think you'll find it tastes even nicer if you stand it the right way up." Soon after Paddington went to live at number 32 Windsor Gardens, Mr. Brown decided to decorate the attic so that he could have a room of his own. But like most of his jobs, it got left half done, until one morning Paddington decided it was high time he stirred things up a bit. Paddington wasn't sure how long it took him to do the wallpapering, but he did discover one thing. Apart from making him hot, it also showed up the ceiling. The ceiling definitely needed whitewashing. "Is that you, Paddington?" shouted Mr. Brown. "Are you all right?" cried Mrs. Brown. "Yes and no," answered Paddington truthfully. The plain fact was that when he'd started work there had been a window and a door. Now there was only a window left. "Perhaps you'd better let yourselves in," he exclaimed, "wherever you are. I think I must have papered myself in by mistake." Paddington expected to be in trouble, but when he was writing his adventure down in his scrapbook that night, he suddenly found himself with several extra lots of bun money. Mrs. Brown gave him some because at long last they had to have a real decorator in, and Mr. Brown's was because he hadn't wanted to do the job anyway. "Bears," said Mrs. Bird, "always fall on their feet." "Perhaps you'd like me to decorate your kitchen for you, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington hopefully. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Bird, and she gave Paddington a little extra something too, just to make sure he didn't. One day, Paddington bought himself a camera in the market. It had a tripod, and a hood to keep out the light, and there was even a book of instructions. Altogether, it seemed very good value indeed. So after taking a quick bite of a marmalade sandwich, he got ready to take his first picture. There was a very interesting chapter in the instruction book on taking action shots. But it wasn't as easy as it sounded. In the end, he decided to take a family group. It seemed much safer. "I hope he's not long," said Mr. Brown. "I've got cramp coming on." "I wouldn't move if I were you," said Jonathan. "We'd never hear the last of it," agreed Judy. "He's only got one plate." "I've only got one leg," groaned Mr. Brown. "Shh, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I think he's doing something." Paddington consulted his instruction book. "I have to measure the distance," he announced. "I'll use this piece of string. If I don't measure the distance properly, I shan't know how far away you are, and you may come out all blurred." "I'd sooner be blurred than have my ear pulled off," grumbled Mr. Brown. "Ooh!" "I'm afraid bears' slipknots are a bit hard to untie," said Paddington. "Anyway, I think I shall have to ask you all to move. The sun's in a different place." "Perhaps if one of us took it," said Mrs. Bird, "you could be in the picture yourself." Paddington considered the matter over a marmalade sandwich. "I shall press the shutter," he announced, "and then run round the front." "Even bears can't run that fast," murmured Mr. Brown. Paddington gave Mr. Brown a hard stare through his lens. But as he did so, something very strange happened. "What on earth's he up to now?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "He looks as if he's practicing for the ballet or something." "Mind my petunias." "Too late," groaned Jonathan. "Are you all right?" called Mrs. Brown. "I think so, Mrs. Brown," said Paddington, "except I've pressed the shutter by mistake. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with a bumblebee again. It must have been after my marmalade sandwich. Perhaps I'd better finish it before anything else happens." No one, least of all Paddington, expected his photograph to come out. But to everyone's surprise, when the plate was developed and printed, there was quite a clear picture. "Not bad," said Mr. Brown. "Not bad at all. What is it?" "Take a look in my window," said the man. Paddington hurried outside in order to see for himself. Apart from his photograph, there was a label. It said, "Picture of a bumblebee, taken by local bear, both very rare." One day, Mr. Gruber took Paddington on an outing to an auction sale. He bought a catalogue of the items to be sold and then found a seat near the front so that they would have a good view of all that went on. Paddington decided straight away that he liked auction sales. It was all very friendly. In fact, he hardly had time to sit down before someone waved. So he waved back. Then another man waved. So he waved at him too, and then raised his hat several more times for good measure.
£4 on bid. £5 over there.
"Going," called the auctioneer, pointing at Paddington. "Going, going, gone." "But I've only just got here," exclaimed Paddington. "Don't worry," said Mr. Gruber. "That's the auctioneer. He's just sold something." Paddington gave the man a hard stare. "I hope it's not that table," he exclaimed. "It must be full of dents by now." "Lot 65, one carpentry set, sold to the young bear with the sandwiches for £5. £5? exclaimed Paddington. "For a carpentry set? But I've only got 10p." Mr. Gruber reached for his wallet. "I expect it was because you waved, Mr. Brown," he whispered. "You see, if you nod your head or even scratch your nose at an auction sale, they often think it's a sign you're interested." Paddington sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, let alone nibble his sandwich, in case he bought something else by mistake. "What am I bid for this old highwayman's pistol?" called the auctioneer. "Once the property of Dick Turpin." "I think I might try for that," whispered Mr. Gruber. "I've been after one for ages." "Come along, who's going to start the bidding?" £10, called someone at the back of the hall. 11, called Mr. Gruber. 12, shouted the other man. "Oh dear," said Mr. Gruber. "I hope I don't lose it, Mr. Brown. £13. 14, shouted Paddington. "Any advance on £14? 15, shouted Paddington wildly. £15, called the auctioneer. "Going, going, gone,"
Sold to the young bear gentleman on my right.
Mr. Gruber began to feel that perhaps taking Paddington to an auction sale wasn't such a good thing after all. "Perhaps I'd better not do any more bidding, Mr. Gruber," began Paddington. "I don't think bears are very good at it."
Lot 67, a very unusual marmalade stand.
Paddington hastily changed his mind. "I'd like one of those," he exclaimed excitedly. "Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because my jars get sticky."
What am I bid for this fine piece of antique silver?
5p, cried Paddington excitedly.
5p, repeated the auctioneer. Did I hear someone say 5p?
6p, said Paddington.
If you ask me, said a voice, that young bear knows something we don't.
Perhaps it's a fake, said another. No one would bid 6p if it were a real silver stand.
Going, said the auctioneer desperately. Is that all I'm bid? Will no one make an advance on 6p? Going, gone.
"And a very good buy indeed, Mr. Brown," said Mr. Gruber later that day. "It more than makes up for the money we lost on your carpentry set and the pistol." "It more than makes up for missing our 11s too, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington happily. "Besides, I think marmalade tastes even better when it comes out of an antique, especially when it's a 6p one." One morning, Paddington was having breakfast in bed when he came across a very interesting article in one of his magazines. It was called "Delight Your Family and Surprise Your Friends," and it showed how to make a magazine rack. All you needed was a sheet of plywood, a hammer, a saw, and a few nails. It sounded very good value indeed. One thing the article hadn't mentioned was how to carry a sheet of plywood and a box of tools at the same time. If it had, he might not have bumped into the Browns' neighbour, Mr. Curry.
Bear, bellowed Mr. Curry. What are you doing, Bear?
"Do it yourself, Mr. Curry," said Paddington.
What's that? How dare you?
"Oh, no, Mr. Curry. I didn't mean you were to do it yourself. I meant I'm going to do it myself. I'm making a magazine rack. Look."
Magazine rack? Yeah, I'd like a magazine rack, Bear. I'm going out now, so you can use my kitchen table to work on, but don't make too much mess. I don't like messes. If you have it ready for me by the time I get back, I may not report you for banging my nose just now.
"Thank you very much, Mr. Curry." Paddington had never actually sawn anything in two before, and he soon discovered it wasn't as easy as it looked. In fact, it got harder and harder. It wasn't until he sat down for a much-needed rest that he discovered why. Mr. Curry now had two small tables with only 2 legs each, instead of one large table with 4 legs. It was really almost beyond repair. Even covering the join with marmalade and drawing the blind couldn't disguise the fact that it was also very wobbly. Paddington decided he had an emergency on his paws. But when he stood up in order to survey his handiwork, he had yet another shock. Mr. Curry's table seemed to have shrunk. In fact, he couldn't remember ever having seen such a short table before. "Delight your family and surprise your friends," he said bitterly. Paddington was quite sure Mr. Curry would be surprised when he saw what was left of his table, but as for delighting the Browns with a magazine rack, that seemed very far away. Mrs. Bird, however, was delighted with what he'd made them. "Most useful," she said. "And how thoughtful to make two," agreed Mrs. Brown. Yes," said Paddington, "but I'm afraid they're not both for you. This one is really Mr. Curry's, but I'm not giving it to him yet. I shall leave it on his doorstep after dark." "After dark?" repeated Judy. "Whatever for?" "I can guess," said Jonathan. "Look out of the window."
Bear!
roared Mr. Curry. "Well, Paddington?" "Perhaps I'd better make Mr. Curry a present of my tools as well," said Paddington. "I don't think I shall be doing it myself again for a long time." "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Paddington, "my next trick is impossible. At least, that's what it says in my instructions."
But you haven't done one yet,
called Mr. Curry.
You can't have a next trick if you haven't done a first one.
"For this trick," said Paddington, ignoring the interruption, "I shall require an egg." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bird. "Can't you use something else?" "No," said Paddington firmly. "It definitely says an egg. I'm going to turn it into a bunch of flowers, if I can get my wand to work."
"I'd sooner you turned it into an omelette," said Mr. Curry. "I'm hungry."
Paddington gave the Brown's neighbour a hard stare. Mr. Curry had invited himself to the party, and the general feeling was that he'd only come for the free tea. The conjuring outfit was a birthday present from all the Brown family, and Paddington was having enough trouble as it was without Mr. Curry's interruptions. "I think it's disgusting," hissed Mrs. Brown, "coming to take the crumbs off a young bear's plate." "He'll be lucky if he gets any crumbs off Paddington's plate." Paddington placed the egg carefully on the table and covered it with a handkerchief. "I shall now say the magic words," he announced. "Abracadabra." "Hey, presto." "Bravo!" called Mr. Gruber.
"Very good,"
remarked Mr. Curry grudgingly.
"All done by sleight of paw, of course, but very good for a bear."
"What's he doing with my daffodils?" asked Mr. Brown. "Shh, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I think he's about to do another trick."
"Well, I wish he'd hurry up," snorted Mr. Curry. "I shall have another biscuit while I'm waiting."
Do you think young Mr. Brown's all right?" asked Mr. Gruber. "He's been gone rather a long time." "No," cried Paddington, "I'm not. It's all dark and I can't read my instructions. I think I'd better try my watch trick instead."
"Good," said Mr. Curry. "I'm fed up with seeing things disappear."
"Perhaps I could borrow your wristwatch, Mr. Curry." "You did say you wanted to see a new trick," said Judy.
"And you're the only person wearing one."
"Don't worry, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "It's all in my instructions. Now, I cover it with the handkerchief, so, and I hit it with the hammer." Oh dear."
"Oh, dear? What do you mean, oh, dear? What's gone wrong, Bear?"
Paddington consulted his instructions. As he did so, he saw the ominous words, "For this trick, it is necessary to use a dummy watch." "I think I forgot to say abracadabra, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed.
"Abracadabra? I'll give you abracadabra. That was a very valuable watch. 20 jewels. Shock-proof."
"It doesn't look very shock-proof to me," said Mr. Brown. And it's certainly not that valuable, said Mr. Gruber. I remember selling it to you 5 years ago, and you didn't pay much for it then. I think I found one of the jewels, Mr. Curry, cried Paddington excitedly.
One of the jewels, bellowed Mr. Curry. What about the other 19? I've never been so insulted in my... What's this? I'm sitting on something sticky.
Oh, dear, said Paddington. That's my disappearing egg, Mr. Curry. It must have reappeared. Perhaps, said Mr. Gruber, you ought to disappear for a while, Mr. Brown. And while you're gone, I'll get Mr. Curry another watch. I've a whole box full in my shop. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. That sounds a very good idea. I don't think I shall reappear again for a long time. One morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brown woke feeling ill, so they went straight back to bed again. The trouble was that with Jonathan and Judy at school and Mrs. Bird away on holiday, there was no one left to take care of them. Don't worry, said Paddington. I'll look after you. Bears are good at looking after people. I'll make you a stew. Aunt Lucy always made one when I wasn't well. Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Brown. I think I feel a relapse coming on. Paddington was very keen on cooking. At least, he always felt he would be if he ever got the chance to have a go. And although he'd never actually made a stew before, he'd often watched Mrs. Bird at work. Mrs. Bird made very good stews. If he had any complaints at all, it was that her dumplings were a little on the small side. Paddington decided that his dumplings would be the biggest ever made. Making dumplings was much harder work than Paddington had expected. And what with that, and the heat of the kitchen, he soon started to nod off. He wasn't sure how long he slept, but he woke with a nasty feeling that he wasn't alone, and that something was coming nearer and nearer. That's funny, said Mr. Brown. There's a great big white thing suddenly appeared in the rockery. It wasn't there just now. A white thing, Mr. Brown, said Paddington innocently. Perhaps it's a snowball. In midsummer? That bird doesn't seem to think much of it, said Mr. Brown. It's just broken its beak. Oh, dear, said Paddington. In that case, I should hurry up and eat yours before it sets. Before it sets, repeated Mr. Brown. Yes, said Paddington. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with my dumplings, but don't worry. I've got some spare mixture under my... At least, I think if you'll excuse me, I'll just go and put my head under the tap. Put your head under the tap? Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other uneasily. You may want some seconds, explained Paddington, and I wouldn't want to disappoint you. There's nothing worse than being without dumplings, especially when you're ill. One morning, when Mr. and Mrs. Brown were ill in bed, Paddington decided to lend a paw with the washing. In a weak moment, he'd even offered to do some of Mr. Curry's pullovers, which was how the clothes dryer came to collapse under the weight. Paddington decided there was only one way out of the problem. He would have to visit a launderette. Before she went away, Mrs. Bird had left some special instructions for just such an emergency, so he loaded up the wheelbarrow and set off. According to the instructions, the Browns' laundry needed hot water, whereas Mr. Curry's pullovers had to have warm, in case they stretched. So he decided to use two machines. Left paw, hot wash. Right paw, warm wash. Left paw, hot wash. Right paw, warm wash.
Bear, what's going on? What are you doing to my washing?
Oh, Mr. Curry. Nothing, Mr. Curry. That is, Oh dear.
What's happened to my pullovers? I had 6 white pullovers when you left this morning.
You wouldn't like one large cocoa-coloured one, would you, Mr. Curry? Asked Paddington hopefully.
What's that?
Or even a kit of parts for making a new one? Mrs. Bird's got some very good patterns.
Ah, come here, Bear.
Perhaps you'd like a cup of cocoa to be going on with, Mr. Curry. There's lots more where this came from, and it's very frothy. One morning, Paddington was having his elevenses with Mr. Gruber when he noticed an old vase. "Broken, I'm afraid," said Mr. Gruber, "and you may not believe this, Mr. Brown, but the person who did it actually called it a jug and offered me 4p." "Fourpence for a spode," exclaimed Paddington. "He obviously didn't know its true value like you do," said Mr. Gruber. "Still, it is what is known as the slow season." "Perhaps I could stick it back together, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington. "It might speed things up a bit for you." Paddington took things very carefully on the way home, which was how he came to see a notice being put into a barber's shop window. It said, "Willing junior wanted, able to sweep floors and look after the shop while the owner is out, apply within." It seemed a very good chance to earn some extra bun money and help Mr. Gruber through his slow season into the bargain. Paddington had never been left in charge of a barber's shop before, and he found it much more interesting than he'd expected. It wasn't until he switched off the clippers that he suddenly heard a voice.
Hey! Don't I get any service around here? I want short back and sides, but nothing off the top. Whatever you do, don't touch the top. And make it snappy. I have a plane to catch.
Paddington peered anxiously up and down the street. Mr. Sloop had said he would only be gone a few minutes, but he was nowhere in sight. And he was about to explain this to the customer when he had yet another shock. The man had gone to sleep. Mr. Brown often went to sleep quickly, especially after a large Sunday lunch, but Mr. Sloop's customer must have held the world's record. Paddington took a deep breath and decided to have a go himself. Unfortunately, when he'd finished, the man's head was so bald that not even a strong dose of Mr. Sloop's magic hair restorer made the slightest difference. Paddington was just toying with the idea of spreading marmalade over it when he caught sight of some clippings on the floor. He was a hopeful bear at heart, but he had a nasty feeling that not even the glue he'd been saving for Mr. Gruber's vase was going to help his present situation. Most of Mr. Sloop's customers seemed to have ginger hair. Curly ginger hair. "Well," said Mr. Gruber, "you said you would speed things up for me, Mr. Brown, and you certainly have. That man you glued the ginger hair onto was one of the biggest antique dealers in America. He bought almost my entire stock, but I still don't understand how he got to hear of me. It's a bit complicated, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. You see, he was wearing a wig, and I must have knocked it off by mistake. It fell in your vase, and when he woke up, he asked me what I was doing with a spode. Truth, Mr. Brown, is sometimes stranger than fiction, particularly where bears are concerned. Have another bun. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber. There's nothing like a bun, especially after a close shave. Paddington stared at the kitchen sink as if he could hardly believe his eyes. "My tooth's gone down the waste disposal," he exclaimed. "I shan't be able to put it under my pillow and get sixpence now." "I'm very sorry," said Mrs. Brown. "It must have got mixed up with the breakfast things." "It was my best tooth," said Paddington. "I've cleaned it twice a day ever since I first had it." I don't know what Aunt Lucy will say. "She'd probably say you shouldn't have eaten that everlasting toffee you made last week. It wouldn't have fallen out then." "I think," said Mrs. Bird, "we'd better pay a visit to the dentist. We don't want any more trouble. Besides, it's an emergency." "Emergency or not," said Mr. Leach, the dentist, "I'm afraid I shall have to charge extra. Bears have 42 teeth. That's 10 more than usual." "I've only got 41, said Paddington. "One of mine's been disposed of." "That's still more than I'm used to. Now, take your scarf off, and I'll see what I can do. Nurse? Nurse, where are you?" "I do hope we're doing the right thing," said Mrs. Brown. "Paddington's never been to the dentist before." "I don't suppose Mr. Leach has had bears before, either," said Mrs. Bird. "I'd like to know what's going on in there." "You have a large piece of tooth missing," said Mr. Leach. "I shall have to make a new gold top for it." "A gold top?" exclaimed Paddington. "I thought only milk bottles had those." Mr. Leach decided to ignore the remark. "Now, don't forget," he said, "this will bother me much more than it does you." "I'm very glad of that," said Paddington. Yes, well, I'm going to put this piece of wax in your mouth so that I can find out the shape of your teeth. Now, say ah, and when I put it in, take a good hard bite." "I'll do my best," said Paddington. "Ah, very good. Now, once more, and don't forget, from now on, whatever happens, don't let go." "Ah," said Paddington. "Ooh," cried Mr. Leach. "Ooh," shouted Paddington excitedly. "Ow!" yelled Mr. Leach. "Ooh! Ow!" repeated Paddington, gripping harder than ever. "Ow!" "It's no good," said Mrs. Brown. "I can't stand it a moment longer." "Hear, hear," agreed Mrs. Bird. "What are you doing to that poor bear?"
Poor bear, poor bear! What about my thumb? Look! Look at it!"
"Perhaps you'd like one of these toffees, Mr. Leach," said Paddington. "I made them myself, and they're very good for taking your mind off things."
Thank you," said Mr. Leach. "Thank you very much."
"I wouldn't if I were you," warned Mrs. Bird. "Remember what happened to Paddington." "Oh, dear," said Paddington. "I think Mr. Leach is having the same sort of trouble with his teeth as I was with mine." "The sooner you get rid of those toffees, the better," said Mrs. Bird. Paddington put on his injured expression. "I'm doing my best," he said, "but nobody seems to like them very much." He was about to suggest Mr. Leach tried saying ah, but he seemed to be having enough trouble with his so he thought better of it. Instead, he got ready to leave. "I think," he announced, "Mr. Leach is the best dentist I've ever been to. I shall always come here when I've had a tooth disposed of." He said it was going to bother him much more than it did me, and he's quite right. It has. Mine feels better already. One day, Paddington parked his shopping basket on wheels outside the baker's while he bought his morning supply of buns. And when he came out again, he found to his surprise there was a large cardboard box inside it. There was a note pinned to the outside. It said, "Your shopping basket on wheels is in such good condition, it shows you are just the kind of person we are looking for. You could be earning £100 a week. Wait here and I will tell you how." Paddington could hardly believe his eyes, let alone his good fortune.
"Ah," said a voice behind him. "I'm glad to see you've accepted our offer of a vacuum cleaner, sir."
"A vacuum cleaner?" exclaimed Paddington.
"That's right, sir. Why, a young gentleman like your good self, with drive and ambition, could make a fortune as one of our sales bears. You'd clean up in no time at all. Mind you, this is a once-only offer. I should look snappy and start demonstrating it while you've got the chance. And don't go telling everyone, or they'll all want to have a go."
"The thing is," said Paddington, "who shall I demonstrate it to?"
"Bear!" bellowed Mr. Curry. "Why don't you watch where you're going? Look at the mess you've made."
"Don't worry, Mr. Curry," announced Paddington. "I can clean that up with my new cleaner. I'm giving free demonstrations."
Did you say free demonstrations? Can you do carpets?
"I can clean anything, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "I've just had it all explained to me."
"In that case, Bear," said Mr. Curry, "come this way. I have a little job you can finish off for me."
Paddington had never demonstrated a vacuum cleaner before, and as it was for Mr. Curry, he decided he would try and impress him by making as big a mess as possible first.
What's going on, Bear? What's that mess? How dare you?
"Don't worry, Mr. Curry. It's all part of my demonstration. I'm just looking for your socket."
My socket? My socket? I haven't got a socket. I haven't even got electricity. I'm on gas.
"Gas," Mr. Curry repeated Paddington. "Oh." "All of which only goes to show," said Mrs. Brown, "that bears should always look before they leap. And neighbours, who are forever trying to get something for nothing, deserve all that happens to them," agreed Mrs. Bird. "I shall never, ever use a vacuum cleaner again," said Paddington. "I shall always sweep the dust under the carpet, like Mr. Brown does." One morning, Paddington came hurrying downstairs as fast as his legs would carry him, and he burst into the dining room looking as if his very life depended on it. "Good gracious," exclaimed Mr. Brown, "what on earth's the matter?" "Look out of the window," cried Paddington. "Everything's gone white in the night. Look at it." "It's all right," said Judy. "There's nothing to worry about. It's only snow. It happens every winter," said Jonathan. "Snow," said Paddington. "What's snow?" "It's a nuisance," said Mr. Brown. "It'll have to be cleared away before I can get the car out." "Don't worry," said Jonathan. "We'll do it for you. Come on, Paddington, you can bring your bucket and spade and lend a paw." Paddington decided he liked snow, especially the brown sort. He made several journeys up and down the path outside their garage. Then he turned his attention to the back garden. It was as he reached the fence that an idea suddenly struck him. He was always getting into trouble with the Browns' neighbour, Mr. Curry, and he felt it might be a chance to do him a good turn and clear some of his paths, too. In fact, taken all round, it was a good chance to kill several birds with one stone. Jonathan and Judy were busy making a snowman, so he tipped several bucketfuls of Mr. Curry's snow over the fence in case they ran out. "Caught you," yelled Jonathan. "Come on, Paddington, let's have a snowball fight." Paddington needed no second bidding. Having a snowball fight sounded even more fun than clearing pathways. "Watch out," he cried, "it's coming." At least, I think it is. "Yeah, missed me by a mile. You'd better get some practice in." Paddington decided that throwing snowballs was much more difficult than it looked, especially with paws. So he thought he would put another plan into operation. On the way up the garden, he did Mr. Curry yet another good turn by closing his back door for him. He felt sure he wouldn't want all the cold air going into his house. Then he crept towards another part of the fence in hope of catching Jonathan by surprise.
"Bear! You been throwing snowballs, Bear?"
"Snowballs?" repeated Paddington. "Did you say snowballs, Mr. Curry?"
"Yes, snowballs. A large one came through my bedroom window just now and landed on my hot water bottle. It's melted in the middle of my bed."
"Oh, dear," said Paddington. "I wouldn't do a thing like that on purpose, Mr. Curry. Besides, it would be much too difficult to get it through a window, especially a large snowball like that."
"Like what, Bear?"
"Like the one you said landed on your bed, Mr. Curry."
"Brr. Well, I must say you've made a good start on my snow. I'm going indoors now, but if you do the rest of the garden by the time I'm dressed, I may give you a penny later on."
"One measly penny for clearing a whole garden," exclaimed Jonathan. "There's no justice in this world." "Oh, I don't know," said Judy. "Perhaps there is. Look."
"Bear!" bellowed Mr. Curry. "Did you shut this door? You've locked me out of my own house. Where are you, Bear? Come back here at once."
"I think he may have gone that way," said Jonathan. "Or was it that way?" asked Judy. "Perhaps," said Paddington hopefully, "I might even have gone that way, Mr. Curry. Whichever it was, I'm not coming this way again today." One day, Mrs. Brown left Paddington outside Crumbold and Ferns so that he could do some secret Christmas shopping on his own. But it wasn't as easy as it looked. In fact, he landed on a tie-pin, and it was very painful. Crumbold and Ferns was a very old established shop, and once you managed to get through the revolving doors, it felt as though time had stood still. It was the kind of shop where the assistants were rarely taken by surprise. So when Paddington announced that he'd come to buy a clothesline, the man scarcely raised his eyebrows, especially when he caught sight of the diamond tie-pin on Paddington's duffel coat. "Perhaps," he said, "you would like to consider one of our special expanding clotheslines, sir, as used by some of the best families in the country. You'd be surprised if I told you the names of some of our customers." "Mine's for Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I'm buying her a new one for Christmas. Hers broke the other day." "Well, we can't have that, sir. Perhaps you'd like to test it. I'm sure it won't let your Mrs. Bird's washing down." "Thank you very much," said Paddington. "It couldn't be more simple. The box contains over 100 yards of best clothesline, and as you pull, it unwinds itself. Then when you've finished, you simply... Oh, dear me. Mr. Wainwright, have you seen a young bear gentleman wearing a blue duffel coat go past? He went that way, towards the China department. Sounds as though he's arrived." Oh, my goodness. Follow that box." Paddington helped himself to a bullseye. The clothesline had turned out to be much longer than he'd expected. Now he was lost, and he definitely felt in need of some refreshment. "Ah, there you are," said the assistant. "I suppose you realize you've tied everyone up in knots. What have you done with the end of the line?" "It's here," said Paddington. "At least, it was a moment ago." "What was that?" asked the assistant. "I said it's here. Here." The assistant stared at him. For some strange reason, he seemed suddenly to have lost the use of his hearing. "Do speak up," he exclaimed. "I can't understand a word you're saying." "Oh dear," said Paddington. "I think my bullseye must have fallen in your ear." "Your bullseye," repeated the man. "Fallen in my ear." "I'm afraid it's a bit slippery where I've been sucking it," began Paddington. "You've been sucking a bullseye in Crumbold and Ferns." But for the second time that morning, the assistant found that he was talking to himself. Paddington had decided it was high time he did one of his disappearing tricks again. He arrived outside the shop just as a very important-looking gentleman was about to go in, and they were soon deep in conversation. "That's Sir Grisham Gibbs," whispered the commissioner. "That young bear found a highly valuable tie-pin belonging to him only this morning." "It wasn't very difficult," said Paddington. "I sat on it by mistake." "Nevertheless, an example to us all. James, as a reward, I would like to place my car at your disposal for the rest of the day. James." "I don't think we shall get back into Crumbold and Ferns for a while. They appear to have some rope caught in their entrance. Perhaps you'd like to continue your shopping elsewhere." "I think that would be a very good idea, Mr. Gibbs," announced Paddington, "especially if James can find a clothesline shop without revolving doors that sells bullseyes as well. I've left my last one in someone's ear, by mistake." Paddington's first Christmas with the Browns was a day to remember. The night before, on Mrs. Bird's instructions, he'd hung a pillowcase on the end of his bed, and next morning he found to his surprise that it was full of parcels. Paddington liked parcels, and he lost no time in opening them. There was a chemistry outfit, a new scrapbook from Mr. Gruber, and a xylophone. Soon the whole house was awake. "I'm as patriotic as the next man," grumbled Mr. Brown, "but I draw a line when bears start playing the national anthem at 6 o'clock in the morning." "There's no need to stand to attention, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I'm not standing to attention. I'm stuck to the floor. Look." "Oh, gosh," said Judy, "that must be the instant glue I gave him for his new scrapbook." "Christmas," groaned Mr. Brown. "Perhaps you'd like to give a hand with the dinner, Paddington," said Mrs. Bird. "There's a lot to be done." "I could test your gravy with some litmus paper from my new chemistry set, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "Bears are very good at testing gravy." See what I mean? Paddington had never eaten one of Mrs. Bird's Christmas dinners before, but he had to admit it was worth waiting for. The table was groaning with good things. There was an enormous plate of turkey to start with, which he soon polished off. And that was followed by mince pies, which went the same way. But best of all was Mrs. Bird's Christmas pudding with custard. Well, Paddington, what do you think of it? Was it worth waiting for? "It was very nice, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington, "except I had a bone in my Christmas pudding." "A bone," repeated Mrs. Brown. "You can't have a bone in a Christmas pudding." "I did," said Paddington firmly. "It was all hard. I nearly broke a tooth." "Mercy me, you know what he's done." "Quick," said Mr. Brown, "we'd better turn him upside down." And before Paddington had time to say anything else, he found himself standing on his head in a corner of the room. "Try jumping up and down," suggested Mrs. Brown. I'm trying to, only it's not easy with paws." "Perhaps we could try using a magnet," suggested Jonathan. "I've got a great big one upstairs." "A magnet?" repeated Paddington. "I've never heard of a bone magnet before." "It's not a bone," said Judy. "It's a 5-penny piece. It's supposed to be lucky. If you find it, you can make a wish." "Lucky," repeated Paddington. "I don't see anything lucky about nearly swallowing a 5-pence. I feel sick." "You mean you haven't swallowed it?" Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. "Why ever didn't you say?" asked Judy. "Nobody asked me," said Paddington. He was about to wish he'd not eaten quite so much Christmas dinner. Then he changed his mind. For really it had been quite the nicest one he'd ever had. So instead he made another wish. Then he pointed to his 5-pence. "Perhaps you'd like a go now, Mr. Brown?" he suggested. No, thank you. I think perhaps I'll leave it until next Christmas. And the way time flies, it won't be long to wait." "That's funny, Mr. Brown. That means my wish is starting to come true already." One morning, Paddington was woken by a strange knocking noise. At first, he thought it was to do with a dream he'd been having, all about a woodpecker being trapped inside his hat. But the marmalade sandwich, which he kept for emergencies, was still there. In any case, the noise hadn't stopped, and when he looked out of the window, he discovered why. Mr. Brown's shed had been replaced by a most unusual-looking hut.
You wait till this heats up, called the workman. It'll take the cobwebs out of your whiskers and no mistake.
Paddington had never heard of a hut for removing cobwebs before, so he put on his duffel coat and, after a quick look at his own whiskers in the mirror, hurried downstairs in order to investigate the matter. He arrived outside the hut at the same time as Mr. Curry.
That's what's known as a sauna bath, Bear. I happen to know that it's a surprise present for Mr. Brown. He's been eating too much lately.
Paddington listened carefully while Mr. Curry explained that a sauna bath was kept full of hot stones, which gave off steam when cold water was poured on them.
It's supposed to be very good for you, Bear. I think I may try it myself, just to make sure it's working properly.
Paddington was most upset by this latest piece of information, and after he'd made sure the coast was clear, he hurried indoors to tell the others. "Just like Mr. Curry," exclaimed Mrs. Bird, "always wanting something for nothing." "Daddy must be the first one to try it," said Judy. "It's his present," agreed Jonathan. "I knew we should have to put a lock on the door," said Mrs. Brown. Paddington felt inside the secret compartment of his suitcase. "Perhaps," he announced, "I could give Mr. Brown a present at the same time. It's a special padlock." Paddington was very proud of his padlock. It worked by numbers, and according to the man in the shop, unless you knew the right ones, it was impossible to open. He had even set it up with Paddington's birthday date, so that he wouldn't forget them. As he stood back to admire it, Paddington was surprised to find that he could still hear knocking. "Hello," he called. "Is anyone there?"
Yes, there is. Is that you, Bear? Let me out at once.
"Coming, Mr. Curry," cried Paddington. "I've only got to set up my birthday dates."
Your birthday date?
"Yes," said Paddington. "It's, oh dear,"
Hurry up,
gasped Mr. Curry.
it's like an oven in here.
"I'm afraid I'm having trouble with my combinations, Mr. Curry," cried Paddington. "Hold on, I shan't be a moment."
What's that? Your combinations? I'll give you combinations. Oh, help, I'm being boiled. It's disgraceful. Phew.
"And what," demanded Mrs. Bird, "are you doing up there?" "I think I've shut Mr. Curry inside by mistake," said Paddington, "and my lock's not working." "You know why," said Judy. "You've used your summer birthday date instead of your winter one." "That's what comes of having 2 birthdays a year," broke in Jonathan. "Bears always do," said Paddington. Everyone waited to see what Mr. Curry would have to say, but for once he was at a loss for words. All he could manage was a loud brrrr. "Perhaps you'd like to borrow my hat to keep you warm, Mr. Curry," called Paddington.
Bear, come down at once. Oh, wait till I get dressed.
One of the nicest presents Paddington ever received was a torch given to him by Mr. Gruber. He used up several batteries reading under the bedclothes and only came out when he reached the end of a chapter or ran out of air. He also began learning the Morse code in case he ever had an emergency in the night. And it was while he was practicing it one evening that he had a sudden shock. Every time he flashed the torch, he received the same signal back again. He tried the first 3 letters of his name, P, D. Dit, da, da, dit, dit, da, da, dit, dit. It was all very strange. The light seemed to be coming from the direction of Mr. Brown's greenhouse, and it definitely needed investigating. In the morning, when it wasn't quite so dark. The next day, Paddington was up bright and early. Thinking the matter over, it seemed a good chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and test his disguise outfit at the same time. According to the label on the box, it was exactly the same as was used by Feathers Lock, the famous detective. By the time he'd finished, he felt sure no one could possibly recognize him. "Ah, there you are, Paddington," called Mrs. Brown. "I was wondering where you'd got to."
Paddington, I'm not Paddington, I'm Feathers Lock.
"Yes, dear, but I should hurry up. Your bacon's getting cold." Paddington looked most upset as he made his way to Mr. Brown's greenhouse. It was bad enough having his disguise penetrated so early on in the case, but looking around, he decided there was also a definite shortage of clues. Apart from a few earwigs and a large marrow, it was almost bare. He consulted his instructions once again. Feathers Lock was a great believer in taking fingerprints. He even included some special powder in his outfit for that very purpose. Looking at Mr. Brown's marrow, Paddington felt it ought to have some very good prints on it indeed, and he lost no further time in getting down to work. "Talking of marrows," said Mr. Brown at dinner that night, "it's hard to believe, but someone's been inside the greenhouse and taken my special prize one." "That's strange," said Mrs. Brown. "I found an enormous marrow on the lawn this morning. I thought you'd put it out for me."
You don't mean... Well, not... This isn't it, my prize marrow. It was a special out-of-season one I was entering for a show.
All eyes turned to Paddington. He seemed to be acting very strangely. "That was my best clue we've been eating," he exclaimed. "It was covered in fingerprints." "I think I've suddenly gone off stuffed marrow," said Jonathan.
Oh, it's all right, said Paddington. I checked most of them. They're nearly all my own paw marks. I expect I made them when I carried it out of the greenhouse.
The Browns watched in silence as Paddington crossed to the window and peered through the glass.
"The thing is,"
said Mr. Brown.
"Why?"
"Because someone keeps signalling from the greenhouse, Mr. Brown," said Paddington excitedly. "They were doing it last night, and they're doing it again tonight. Look. Dit-da, dit-da." "That's not someone in the greenhouse," said Jonathan. "That's the reflection on the glass from your own torch." "The reflection from my own torch," repeated Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. "What are you doing now?" asked Judy.
"I'm sending another message," said Paddington. "An important one. Dit, 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 da, 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 dit, dit, dit."
That means SOS in Morse code. It's for emergencies. It's short for, "Help, I'm in trouble again." One morning, Paddington was putting some finishing touches to a snowman when he heard a familiar voice.
"Bear? Is that you, Bear?"
"I was only making a snowman, Mr. Curry," called Paddington. "I wasn't throwing snowballs."
"That's all right," said Mr. Curry. "I was wondering if you'd like to urge yourself some Bud Buddy." I've got a nasty cold in my nose. I'd like you to fetch a plumber.
A plumber, repeated Paddington. Wouldn't you sooner have a doctor, Mr. Curry?
No, I wouldn't. My bathroom pipes are frozen, and I can't fill my hot water bottle. But tell him not to make too much noise in case I'm asleep. If you're quick, I may give you 5p when I'm better.
Yes, Mr. Curry, said Paddington gloomily. Paddington wasn't too happy running errands for the Browns' neighbour, and he felt even less keen when he met the plumber.
Curry, said the man. He's not the only one with a cold. Besides, he hasn't paid me for my last job yet. That was months ago. Tell you what, though. Take him this book on plumbing. Tell him he can do it himself if he likes.
Paddington gazed at the book. He couldn't picture Mr. Curry getting out of bed to mend his pipes, and he had a nasty feeling things were going to get very much worse before they got any better. I wonder what's happening in Mr. Curry's house, said Mrs. Brown. Paddington went in ages ago, and there's been an awful lot of banging going on ever since. If it sounds bad in here, said Mrs. Bird, think what it must be like next door. It's not what it sounds like that bothers me, said Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown wasn't the only one feeling worried at that moment. Paddington had managed to get Mr. Curry's water flowing again, but not, unfortunately, into the basin. According to the instruction book, very old lead pipes, like Mr. Curry's, could sometimes be mended by hitting them with a mallet. But as fast as he hit one spot, another leak sprang up somewhere else, and the way things were going, he would soon need more boots.
What's going on? What's all that hammering?
It's all right, Mr. Curry. I'm just going for some more Wellingtons.
Wellingtons? Did you say Wellingtons? There's water everywhere. Look at it. Where's the stopcock?
I've tried that, Mr. Curry, but it won't move. I think the spanner's frozen to it.
Stand aside, Bear. I'll show you how to fix it. Take hold of the mallet. When I nod my head, you hit it.
Are you sure, Mr. Curry? Asked Paddington.
Don't argue, Bear. Do as you're told.
Yes, Mr. Curry. If you say so, Mr. Curry.
Right. Bear, down.
Bear! Mr. Curry's bellow of rage was equalled only by the sound of Paddington's feet as he hurried down the stairs. There were times when he felt the best course was to disappear with all possible speed, and this was definitely one of them. Paddington didn't see the Browns' neighbour again for several days, but one morning a note arrived. It was addressed to him in Mr. Curry's handwriting, and it said,
Thank you for having a go at my pipes the other day. You left the bathroom in such a mess, the insurance company agree it needs completely redecorating, and they're paying. It's what's known as an act of bear. Yours gratefully, Mr. Curry.
Inside the envelope was a brand new 5p piece. If I were you, said Mrs. Bird, I'd have it framed. It's probably the one and only time you'll ever get 5p off Mr. Curry. Paddington considered the matter for a moment. I think perhaps I might use it to insure myself, Mrs. Bird, he announced. It sounds very good value, and you never know, I might have trouble with my own pipes one day. One day, Mr. Gruber decided to take Paddington on a mystery outing. He gave him a bar of chocolate for his lunch, and they set out early in order to avoid the crowds. Paddington liked outings with Mr. Gruber, and to have a mystery thrown in as well seemed very good value indeed. Wait until you get inside, said Mr. Gruber. You're in for a surprise. Paddington grew more and more mystified. The building seemed to be full of people in strange clothes, standing about doing nothing. "I shan't be a moment, Mr. Gruber," he called. "I just want to buy some souvenirs." He hurried over to a nearby kiosk and raised his hat politely, several times, to the lady behind the counter. But for some strange reason, she didn't reply. "Excuse me," he announced. "I'd like 3 large postcards, please. One for my scrapbook, one for Aunt Lucy, and one for Mr. Gruber." "I don't think you're going to be very lucky. I think she's made of wax, Mr. Brown." "Made of wax?" exclaimed Paddington. He gave the lady a hard stare. "I've never heard of anyone being made of wax before." "You'll find a lot of people like that in here, Mr. Brown. Most of them aren't real at all. It's what's known as a Waxworks museum." Mr. Gruber went off to buy some tickets, and after he'd gone, Paddington gazed round the hall. Apart from having no souvenirs, his chocolate was beginning to melt. Not wishing to offend his friend, he looked for somewhere to deposit it. And nearby, he thought he saw the very thing.
"Here," said the attendant. "What do you think you're doing? That's my ticket box. It's not for the likes of young bears to drop their remains in."
"I'm very sorry," exclaimed Paddington. "I thought you were a Waxworks like everyone else."
"Waxworks? I'll give you Waxworks. Come back here."
But Paddington was already making good his escape. Hurrying down some stairs, as fast as his legs would carry him, he found himself in another large room, full of figures. Worse still, he could hear the sound of voices getting nearer and nearer. He decided there was only one thing for it. He would have to become a Waxworks himself.
"And this group," said a voice, "represents England at the time of Charles I. In the middle is Oliver Cromwell, about to join the Ironsides."
"If that's Oliver Cromwell," said a woman, "then aim the Queen of Sheba."
"Besides, they never wore duffel coats in them days,"
agreed a man.
"Horrible,"
complained another woman. "Don't look, Deirdre."
"I don't know," said her husband. "Horrible it may be, but fancy making all them whiskers out of wax."
"Oh!" shrieked Deirdre. "I'm sure I saw his nose move." "There you are! I told you so! He's done it again!" Paddington decided he was fed up. Apart from an itchy nose, he was beginning to wish he'd picked an easier pose. And he felt hungry. "I'm not Oliver Cromwell about to join the Ironsides," he announced. "I'm Paddington Bear, and I'm about to feed my insides. Good afternoon."
"I doubt if even Oliver Cromwell could have made a better exit than that," said Mr. Gruber later that day. "And he couldn't have surprised his audience more. It's in all the evening papers. Waxworks Museum latest, Chamber of Horrors mystery deepens." Lots of people go on mystery outings, Mr. Brown, but not many can say they've actually taken part in one. Paddington considered the matter. Although he hadn't managed to buy any postcards, he felt sure the newspaper cuttings would look very good in his scrapbook. "All the same, I'm glad I didn't live in Mr. Cromwell's time," he announced. "It must have been difficult drinking cocoa in a helmet." And I'm sure he never went on such nice outings. One morning, Paddington came down to breakfast, and as he entered the dining room, he nearly fell over backwards with surprise. Overnight, a great change had come over the room. The pictures and the curtains had been taken down, and all the furniture was covered with sheets. In fact, the only thing left was a large cardboard box by the fireplace. "That's Mr. Brown's new chimney sweeping outfit," explained Mrs. Brown. "We're about to have a good spring clean." "After we've been to the sales," said Mrs. Bird. "I've put your bacon and eggs ready for you in the kitchen. We can't stop now.
We want to get to the shops before the rush, added Mrs. Brown. Paddington peered thoughtfully at the box lid and then hurried out to the kitchen. His mind was on other things all through his breakfast that morning. He'd never heard of anyone doing special cleaning in the spring before, and he decided it might be a very good idea if he surprised the Browns by lending a helping paw while they were out shopping. There was no time like the present. And really, what better way to start than with a chimney? The brush went up very quickly indeed. And down came the soot. Paddington decided not to take any chances. And armed with Mr. Brown's binoculars, he hurried outside in order to make sure all was well. It was just like looking at the picture on the lid of the box. It was all very exciting. And all that remained now was to take the brush to pieces again. It wasn't until he got to the end that he spotted a warning notice inside the box lid. When removing rods from chimney, great care must be taken, otherwise the brush may become detached. Paddington gazed mournfully at the end of the rod. There was no doubt about it, his own brush had become detached. And he had a nasty idea where it might be. There was only one thing for it. He would have to borrow Mr. Brown's ladder and go up on the roof before the others got back.
Jackdaws, said Mr. Briggs, the builder. You got a jackdaw's nest in your chimney. You can hear 'em coughing.
Coughing? Repeated Mrs. Bird.
I didn't know jackdaws coughed. You'd cough, Mum, if you lived up a chimney. Never mind, I'll have it down in a jiffy. Yeah, what did I tell you?
That's not a nest, said Mrs. Bird. It's Mr. Brown's brush. Paddington, exclaimed Mrs. Brown. I knew we shouldn't have left him on his own for so long. Mercy me, look, there he is. I'm afraid, said Paddington, I've got my head stuck in the chimney pot. It came away when I was trying to rescue Mr. Brown's brush.
Well, I'll say one thing, exclaimed Mr. Briggs. You may not have the cleanest bear in Windsor Gardens, but I reckon you must have the cleanest chimney by now.
Thank you, Mr. Briggs, said Paddington. I'm sorry I'm having trouble raising my pot. It's a bit difficult with paws. Perhaps I'll raise my hat twice the next time we meet. Paddington was in a mess, and for once it wasn't entirely his fault. The person mostly to blame was a lady called Granny Green. Granny Green wrote cookery articles for one of Mrs. Brown's magazines, and it was her recipe for oldie-fashioned butter toffee that was really the cause of Paddington's downfall. If it hadn't appeared on the very day Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were out shopping, Paddington might not have been quite so tempted to have a go himself. He tried adding some more ingredients for good measure. But for once, luck didn't seem to be on his side. When he went to stir it, he found that Toffee had already set hard. Paddington gazed gloomily at the saucepan. All Granny Green's saucepans were as bright as a new pin. There was certainly no mention of any of them having spoons stuck inside them. Nor, for that matter, were her kitchen windows all steamed up. Paddington decided it was high time he cleaned them before they set hard, too. Toffee steam was very sticky. It was then that he had his second shock of the day. As he rubbed the glass clean, he caught sight of Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird outside. They appeared to be trying to say something, but he didn't stop to see what it was. Instead, he sat down and waited for the storm to break. "What on earth's been going on?" cried Mrs. Bird. "I've been trying my paw at toffee making," said Paddington sadly. "I thought it would be a surprise." "Toffee? It looks more like glue to me." "I've never seen such a mess," agreed Mrs. Bird. "I suggest a certain young bear had better get down on his paws and knees and scrub my kitchen floor." Mrs. Bird paused. While she'd been talking, a strange look had come over Paddington's face. "Is anything the matter?" she asked. "I'm not sure, Mrs. Bird," gasped Paddington. I've got a bit of a pain in my stomach, and I can't put my legs out straight. You haven't been eating this stuff, have you?" "Well, I did test it once or twice, Mrs. Brown," groaned Paddington. "Wish I hadn't now." "Gracious me, no wonder you've got a pain. It's probably set in a hard lump inside. I'll call an ambulance." "An ambulance?" "Bears," said Mrs. Bird grimly, "have emergencies the same as anyone else. I shall dial 999. "Oh," groaned Paddington. "Couldn't you dial 111 instead, Mrs. Bird? It would be a lot quicker." Sir Mortimer Carraway opened the door of the hospital emergency ward and peered round the waiting room. "Are you that young bear's next of kin?" he asked. The Browns exchanged anxious glances. Somehow they had expected a much longer wait. "Well, he lives with us," said Mrs. Brown, "but he comes from darkest Peru." "Is he going to be all right?" asked Judy. "I think he'll pull through. Bad case of galloping toffee drips. Most unusual. On the stomach, too. Worst possible place." "Galloping toffee drips," repeated Mr. Brown. "I think I must have spilt some on my fur by mistake," explained Paddington. "I had my duffel coat open when I was stirring it. I expect it set hard when I sat down for a rest." "I'm afraid this will leave him with a bare patch for a week or two, but a strict diet of marmalade will soon make it grow again." "Perhaps I could glue it back on with some more toffee," said Paddington hopefully. "If you don't mind," said Sir Mortimer, "I shall keep it. I've never had a bear's emergency before, and I'd like to have this fur framed." "In that case," said Paddington, "perhaps I'd better start on my diet straight away, Sir Mortimer. Otherwise I might catch cold before it grows again, and then you'd have another emergency on your hands." One evening, the Browns settled down to watch a television quiz program called Lucky for Some. To their surprise, instead of seeing Ronnie Playfair, the quizmaster, Paddington appeared on the screen. "It's all right, Mrs. Bird," he announced. "Mr. Gruber's with me." Yes, said Ronnie Playfair. "Hello, everyone. Well, now, tonight you have a choice of subjects: geography, history, or mathematics." "I think I'd like to try my paw at mathematics, please, Mr. Playfair," said Paddington. "Bears are good at sums." "Fancy choosing maths," exclaimed Jonathan. "Knowing that bear, it may be a wise choice. He keeps his accounts very well." "Good. Well, here's a nice easy one to start with. For £5, how many buns make 5? 2.5, said Paddington. 2.5? You wouldn't like to try again? "No, thank you," said Paddington firmly. Then I'm afraid you're out of the contest. But I always share my buns, said Paddington. I break them in half.
Here, give Mr. Brown the money, shouted a voice which sounded suspiciously like Mr. Gruber's. Yes, well, we'll try again. Here's an 8-foot plank. If you cut it in half, then cut those 2 pieces in half, then cut all the pieces in half again. How many pieces would you have? 8, said Paddington. Very good. Now, for £25, how long will each of the pieces be? 8 feet, said Paddington. I think. 8 feet? You're sure you won't change your mind? Quite sure, thank you, Mr. Playfair, said Paddington. Oh, Paddington, cried Judy. I told you we shouldn't have chosen maths, said Jonathan. I'm afraid the answer's 1 foot. You'd have 8 pieces each 1 foot long. Not if you cut them down the middle, said Paddington firmly. If you cut them down the middle, you'd have 8 pieces 8 feet long. He's right. Give him the money. Give him the money.
Ronnie Playfair gazed at Paddington. One last question, he said, and this time it's for £100. Why ever doesn't he stop now and make sure of what he's got, said Mrs. Brown. If it takes 2 men 20 minutes to fill a bath using 1 tap, how long will it take 1 man to fill the same bath using both taps? You have 10 seconds starting from now. No time at all, said Paddington promptly. Wrong. It will take him exactly half the time. It's on the card. I'm very sorry, Mr. Playfair, said Paddington politely, but you did say it was the same bath, and nobody let the first lot of water out.
He's right, exclaimed Mr. Brown. Give him the money.
Don't be silly, Henry. He can't hear you. I don't know so much, said Judy. Look. Back in the studios, Ronnie Playfair seemed to be making the best of a bad job.
Congratulations, Bear, he said grudgingly. You've won the jackpot.
I've won a jackpot? Exclaimed Paddington hotly. He directed a hard stare at the quizmaster.
Containing 100 crisp, new £1 notes.
Gosh, said Jonathan, £100. Good old Paddington.
The point is, what will you do with it all?
Paddington considered the matter for a moment. I think, he announced at last, I'd like to give it to the Home for Retired Bears in Lima, where my Aunt Lucy lives. They only have marmalade on Sundays, so I expect it'll come in very useful.
I think you'd better send the pot as well. If they have £100 of marmalade, they'll need something to put it all in.
Thank you, Mr. Playfair, said Paddington. Perhaps I could help you with your program another day. I could try my poor geography next time. Bears are good at that, too. One day, Mr. Curry entered a golf competition, and he asked Paddington to act as his caddy. Paddington wasn't very keen on doing favours for Mr. Curry. They always seemed to turn out wrong. All the same, he felt most important as he made his way onto the golf course. Especially when Arnold Parker, the world-famous champion who was acting as judge, waved to him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Parker," he called.
There you are, Bear, exclaimed Mr. Curry. Thought you were never coming. Anyway, now you are here. Keep your eyes open, and remember, I shall hold you responsible if my ball gets lost.
It's all right, Mr. Curry, said Paddington. I've marked it with a special marmalade chunk.
Marmalade chunk? Snorted Mr. Curry. Are you sure it won't come off?
Quite sure, Mr. Curry, said Paddington. Mrs. Bird always says my chunks stick to anything.
Well, I hope you're right, Bear. This is a very important event. It's to see who can hit the ball the furthest. I don't want my ball getting mixed up with anyone else's. Now, when I go up to collect my prize, I'd like you to... Bear! That's my best club you've broken.
Perhaps you could tie the two ends together, Mr. Curry, said Paddington hopefully.
Tie the ends together? Bellowed Mr. Curry. Why,
Is anything the matter? Asked Arnold Parker. Can I be of assistance? Hello, Mr. Parker. exclaimed Paddington. "I'm afraid I've been having trouble with Mr. Curry's clubs." "You're welcome to borrow mine," said Arnold Parker. "Parker?" said Mr. Curry. "Not the Arnold Parker?" "I was only joking, of course, Bear. Remind me to give you 5p when we get home. Now, have you got my tea?" "Your tea, Mr. Curry?" exclaimed Paddington. "You can have one of my marmalade sandwiches if you like. It was fresh this morning. I made it specially." I mean the sort of tea you put your ball on. I want to address it." Paddington began to look more and more confused. He'd never heard of anyone hitting a ball off a marmalade sandwich before, let alone writing his address on it. "I think," whispered Arnold Parker, "your friend means he's ready to go." Paddington was about to take cover when there was a loud cry from Mr. Curry. "Ooh! Bear, I've just slipped on your marmalade sandwich. I've hurt my leg. Now I shan't be able to play." "Perhaps I could do it instead, Mr. Curry. Your old club is just the right length now." Mr. Curry sat up holding his leg. He looked as if he had a lot more to say, but fortunately his voice was drowned by a passing train. "4!" shouted Arnold Parker above the noise. "5!" cried Paddington excitedly. Mr. Curry stared at the Browns. "I've won a new set of golf clubs," he exclaimed. "No," said Mrs. Brown, "Paddington did, but he's giving them to you to make up for your breaking yours." "His ball went 9 miles. "Arnold Parker says it must be a world record," broke in Jonathan. "I bet the engine driver was surprised." "The engine driver? What is everyone on about?" "Your ball landed in a goods train by mistake, Mr. Curry," explained Paddington. "The driver sent it back from the next station, and Mr. Parker said there was nothing in the rules to stop it being counted. So I won first prize." "Unlike some people," broke in Mrs. Bird, "bears always fall on their feet." "That's what Mr. Parker said," exclaimed Paddington. "He's going to put marmalade chunks on all his golf balls in future. He thinks it might bring him luck. Besides, if he ever gets lost in a bunker, at least he'll never go hungry." One day, Mr. Curry stepped on one of Paddington's marmalade sandwiches by mistake and ended up in hospital. From that moment on, the Browns were bombarded with postcards asking for supplies. Cakes, grapes, magazines, the list was never ending. So Paddington offered to take it all in his shopping basket on wheels. "I do hope we're doing the right thing," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington set off for the hospital. "I shouldn't worry," replied Mrs. Bird. "Knowing that bear, he'll look after himself." "It's not Paddington I'm worried about," said Mrs. Brown. "It's the hospital." "Can I help you?" asked the receptionist. Well, said Paddington, "I've really come to see Mr. Curry, but I wonder if I ought to have my head examined first." "Your head? Oh, dear. Is it urgent?" "Very," said Paddington firmly. "I think I've packed too many marmalade sandwiches under my hat." "It sounds to me as though you need to see a psychiatrist," said the lady. "A psychiatrist?" repeated Paddington. "I've never heard of one of those before. It's a very long word for people who look after things up here. I'll get our Mr. Hines to deal with you. He takes on all our difficult cases, and he's never had a failure yet. Thank you very much, said Paddington, but I hope he likes marmalade. He might get rather sticky. As Paddington settled himself down in Mr. Heinz's consulting room, he decided he liked hospitals. He was just about to nod off when the door opened. "Ah, there you are," said Mr. Heinz. "I'm glad to see we're all ready. We're going to play a little game together. It's to test your reactions. I'm going to call out some words, and I want you to give me another word with the opposite meaning, right?" "Wrong," said Paddington promptly. Mr. Heinz glared at him. "Wait until I give you the go-ahead. Now, 1, 2, 3, go." "Stop," said Paddington. Very good," said Mr. Heinz. "Very bad," said Paddington eagerly. "Now, look here." "Look there," cried Paddington. He broke off and gazed at the doctor. "Can't you think of any more words, Mr. Heinz?" he asked. Mr. Heinz decided to have one more go. "White," he said, more in hope than in anger. "Black," said Paddington. "Big." "Small." "Fast." "Slow." "Fine." "Wet." Mr. Heinz began to look better pleased. "Well," he said, "we've nearly finished." "We've only just started," cried Paddington. "No, we haven't." "Yes, we have." "No, no, no!" "Yes, yes, yes!" "You stop!" yelled Mr. Heinz. "No, I won't!" cried Paddington, falling off the couch in his excitement. "To think! My first failure in 40 years! A bear! I should have my head examined." As the door slammed shut, Paddington looked most surprised. He'd been in the hospital for ages, and he was still no nearer seeing Mr. Curry, let alone having his hat removed. "I think," he announced to the world in general, "if I ever get my hat stuck on again, I shall use a shoehorn. It's much easier than seeing a doctor, especially when you're hungry." One day, Mr. Brown arranged to take everyone out to lunch at a new restaurant he'd been told about. Paddington arrived first, and to pass the time he consulted his favorite book, the Duncan Hyde Good Food Guide. Mr. Hyde went around the country testing restaurants, awarding the ones he liked best special hats as prizes. The very best were given bowler hats, but as far as Paddington could make out, the present one didn't rate even so much as a cloth cap. All the same, his mouth was starting to water. And it began to water even more when he caught sight of the sweet trolley. The Browns were still nowhere in sight, so he came to a decision. It seemed much more sensible to wait for them inside the restaurant. "Bonjour, monsieur. May I be of assistance?" asked the waiter as Paddington drew near. "No, thank you," said Paddington sadly. "I was only looking. I think some of the sweets on that trolley might be worth a bowler in my food guide." To Paddington's surprise, his words seemed to have a magical effect on the waiter, and he immediately fetched the manager. "I can't tell you how delighted we are that you've honored us with a visit," he boomed. "You can't?" exclaimed Paddington in surprise. "Pray follow me," said the manager. "Thank you very much," said Paddington. "I've put you in a window, sir, so that everyone can see, so that you can see better. Now, may I find something to titillate your palate?" "Yes, please," said Paddington eagerly, "but I'm not sure if I can afford it." "My dear sir, we don't want to bother ourselves with mere money." "Don't we?" exclaimed Paddington. "Certainly not," said the manager. "Our chef is at your disposal. We want you to feel completely at home." "Oh, I do already," said Paddington. "When can I start? I'm hungry."
Well, said the manager, I can recommend our avocado pear filled with sea-fresh prawns, or there's Dover fresh sole, farm fresh veal, oven fresh steak and kidney pudding. I think I'd like to try some of each, please, Paddington announced rashly. My palate's very titivated. Some of each? I must say, sir, you take your job very seriously. Would you care to test one of our rare old wines as well? Paddington considered the matter for a moment. I think I'd sooner have some tin fresh cocoa, he said, but not too hot, please. I'm having lunch with Mr. and Mrs. Brown at 1 o'clock. Another lunch? Good gracious. I'd better leave you to your task, sir, but I do hope you'll see fit to mention us when the time comes. Oh, yes, said Paddington happily. I shall tell all my friends, just as soon as I've finished. And what, asked Mrs. Brown, are you doing, Paddington? We were expecting to find you outside, said Mr. Brown. I wish you had, groaned Paddington. Oh, I've eaten too much. Paddington? Echoed the waiter. Paddington? Do you mean to say, we thought you was Duncan Hyde, come to test our dishes for the guide? By the look of the bill, said Mr. Brown, he'll be testing the washing-up machine. Gosh, said Jonathan, it's over £17. There's £2 for a peach surprise, said Judy. I've got another surprise, said Paddington unhappily. I've only got 5p. I'm very sorry about this, began Mr. Brown. Sorry? Exclaimed the manager. We only opened 2 days ago, and look at the crowds. Half London must be queuing to get in. I wish we could have that young bear sitting in the window every day of the week. Even if we haven't been awarded a Duncan Hyde hat, he must be worth his weight in lobster souffle. Oh! Paddington let out a loud groan at the thought. Perhaps, he announced, you'd like to borrow my hat instead. I think I've gone off eating, so I shan't be needing it again for a day or two. One day, Paddington was making his way down the Portobello Road in order to have his morning cocoa with Mr. Gruber when he came across a very unusual poster. But if the poster looked interesting, the view through the fence was even more exciting. And he couldn't wait to tell his friend all about it. It's what's known as a fair, said Mr. Gruber. And if you've never been to one, Mr. Brown, then you have never lived. Paddington always enjoyed his chats with Mr. Gruber, and on the subject of fairs, his friend was obviously an expert. There are slides, Mr. Brown, and roundabouts, and swings, and dodgem cars, and usually there is a big wheel. You must go on the big wheel. It sounds very nice, said Paddington, but is it very expensive? I've only got 10p. In that case, Mr. Brown, I suggest you visit the fortune teller first. She may know if you are coming into more money. Paddington needed no second bidding, and as luck would have it, almost the first thing he came across was a tent belonging to someone called Madame Zaza. The notice on the outside said, palms red, crystal gazing, patronized by royalty, satisfaction guaranteed. It seemed very good value indeed. Excuse me, Mrs. Zaza, he announced. I'd like to have my paw read, please. I want to see if I'm coming into a fortune or not. I don't usually do bears, said Madame Zaza, but if you cross my palm with silver, I'll see what I can do. Not wishing to spend his 10p, Paddington rummaged in the secret compartment of his suitcase. I think I've got a Peruvian centavo, he announced. They're silver. I don't take foreign coins, said Madame Zaza. Anyway, crossing the palm means dropping it in and not taking it away again.
She broke off and gazed disbelievingly at Paddington's paw.
You seem to have a very long lifeline. I don't think I've ever seen quite such a long one before.
I don't think it is a lifeline, Mrs. Zaza, said Paddington. It's an old marmalade chunk. It must have got stuck on at breakfast by mistake.
Well, I certainly can't read your paw if it's covered with marmalade, said Madame Zaza. You'll have to pay extra and have the crystal ball. Now, when is your birthday?
June the 25th and December the 25th, said Paddington.
You can't have 2 birthdays a year, exclaimed Madame Zaza. Nobody has 2 birthdays, except the Queen.
Bears do, said Paddington firmly. Bears always have 2.
Then that makes it more difficult, said Madame Zaza, and much more expensive.
Paddington gave a sigh. As far as he could make out, even if Madame Zaza did discover he was coming into a fortune, he wouldn't be able to afford her fees. But Madame Zaza was already busy with her crystal ball.
I see a cloud, she said, a pink cloud. It's getting bigger and bigger. Really, this is most exciting. It's never happened before.
You put candy floss all over my crystal ball. Where are you? Come back. But Paddington had gone. He'd had quite enough fortune-telling for one day, and he felt it was high time he spent his tenpence on something more important. I think, he announced, I can see a journey all the way to the big wheel, starting now. One day, to Paddington's surprise, he arrived downstairs for tea, only to find the Browns were holding a party in his honour. All the family were there, Mrs. Bird, Mr. Curry, and Mr. Gruber. I've brought you a book on paper-tearing, Mr. Brown. I thought you might be able to entertain us.
I like paper-tearing tricks. I hope they're good.
Paddington hurried over to the table in order to consult his new book. The first one, Mr. Curry, he said, is called The Mystery of the Disappearing Banknote. I'm afraid I've left my wallet in my other jacket, said Mr. Brown. And I only have silver, said Mr. Gruber. I think it's up to you, Mr. Curry.
All right, but hope you know what you're doing, Bear.
Oh, yes, Mr. Curry, announced Paddington. Mr. Gruber's book has even got pictures showing you how to do it. Now, I take the note, and I fold it in two, then I fold it in two again, then I tear bits out of it. Oh, dear. His face dropped as he consulted his book. Then I put it under my hat.
What are you doing now, Bear?
Growled Mr. Curry. Oh, dear, I'm afraid something's gone wrong, Mr. Curry. The banknote was supposed to turn up inside your ear. Have you tried looking in the other one, dear? Asked Mrs. Brown. I think I turned over 2 pages at once, said Paddington. I've done the paper doily trick by mistake.
What? Bellowed Mr. Curry. Doily? That's my pound note. It's full of holes.
Don't worry, Paddington. I'll pay. It won't have to come out of your bun money. Anyway, we have a surprise for you. We've had a cable from the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. It seems your Aunt Lucy is celebrating her 100th birthday soon, Mr. Brown. Fancy being 100, exclaimed Jonathan. Bears' years are different, said Judy. They have 2 birthdays a year for a start. Anyway, we wondered if you'd like to be there. Paddington sat down in order to consider the matter. His mind was in such a whirl. I don't know what to say, he murmured. I shouldn't say anything, said Mrs. Bird. Have a piece of cake instead. I made it specially. It's got Bon Voyage written on it. That means we hope you have a good journey. "Thank you very much, everybody," said Paddington. "But if I'm going back to Peru, I think perhaps I'd better go upstairs and pack." "Don't be long," called Judy. "Your cocoa will get cold."
It'll seem very quiet without you, Bear, called Mr. Curry. "I don't know who'll do my odd jobs for me."
"Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown.
"Oh, well, no more marmalade stains on the walls."
"I shall leave them on. I'm not having them washed off for anyone." "Crumbs," cried Judy. "Here he comes again. That was quick." "I've packed my things," announced Paddington, "but I've left my flannel out in case I need a wash before I leave." "You've packed?" repeated Mrs. Bird. "But what about all the stuff in your room?" "I'm only taking my important things," said Paddington. "I shall leave everything else upstairs for safety." Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. "Paddington," said Mrs. Bird, "you'll never know how happy you've made us feel. We thought perhaps you were leaving us for good." "For good?" exclaimed Paddington. He collapsed into a nearby armchair at the thought. "That wouldn't be for good, Mrs. Bird. That would be for bad." "One thing," said Mr. Gruber. "You'll be able to wash Mr. Brown's stains off after all. He can start afresh when he gets back." "I think that's a very good idea, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington. "If I'm going all the way to South America, I expect I shall pick up some very interesting new ones, especially in darkest Peru. I can't wait to bring them back." One day, Mr. Gruber took Paddington on an outing to the law courts. "I think you'll find it interesting, Mr. Brown," he said. "It's a bit like watching a television play. Wait here, and I'll see if I can find you a good case to watch." Paddington thanked Mr. Gruber, and then settled down to a quick sip of some of Mrs. Bird's steaming hot cocoa. To his surprise, he'd hardly begun when he heard his name being called.
"Calling Mr. Brown. Calling Mr. Brown. Here, is your name Brown? 'Cause if it is, they're waiting for you."
"Mr. Gruber must have been quick," exclaimed Paddington.
"I don't know about Mr. Gruber. It's old Justice Eagle trying the case today, and he don't like to be kept waiting. You best get a move on."
"I'm sorry, Mr. Eagle," called Paddington. "I'm afraid my eyes got steamed up."
"Your eyes got steamed up? 'Pon my soul, in all my years as a judge, I've never heard of that as an excuse before."
"It's not an excuse, Mr. Eagle. It's the cocoa."
"Do you swear?"
Paddington gave the man a hard stare.
"Never. My Aunt Lucy taught me not to." "Silence in court." "I see no mention of an Aunt Lucy, Mr. Cloudsworthy. Do I take it the prosecution are not going to call her? To tell you the truth,
I don't think she would hear you if you did call her, Mr. Eagle. She's in Peru."
Aunt Lucy is in Peru? I find this very hard to accept."
With respect, my lad, I don't think she's important." "Aunt Lucy's not important?" exclaimed Paddington. "She brought me up." "Quite so, but we have a very big case here." "I've got a small one. It's got a secret compartment where I keep all my important papers."
"Really? I thought perhaps it was where you kept your briefs."
"My briefs? But I'm only here for the day."
"Silence! This is no laughing matter. Briefs are papers lawyers bring with them when they attend court."
"Oh, I don't have any of those, Mr. Eagle," said Paddington, "but I've got some marmalade sandwiches."
"Is this really part of the evidence you're submitting, Mr. Cloudsworthy? A bear's sandwich? We'd better mark it Exhibit A. I'll examine it more closely later."
"Mrs. Bird will be pleased," said Paddington. "I don't think she's ever had any of her marmalade exhibited before, especially in court."
In that case, we'd better call her. Perhaps she can throw some light on this unfortunate affair. Call Mrs. Bird. Call Mrs. Bird.
"I don't think she's here either. I expect she's out shopping with Mrs. Brown."
Mrs. Bird's out shopping? Really, this is intolerable. Is there no one here today?
"You could try Mr. Gruber," said Paddington. "I know he's here. At least, he was."
Call Mr. Gruber. Call Mr. Gruber. Good gracious.
"I'm afraid," said Mr. Gruber, "there has been a slight misunderstanding. As I'm sure your lordship realizes, there are a good many Browns in this world. I believe this is the one you really wanted to see." Mr. Justice Eagle looked at Paddington and then at the exhibits in front of him.
"It's been a very trying morning," he said, "in more ways than one. I think perhaps it's time we stopped for elevenses."
Paddington was most impressed at the thought of a judge knowing about elevenses. "Perhaps, Mr. Eagle," he said, "you'd like some more exhibits. There are lots more where this one came from, and I don't suppose I shall be coming to court again for a long time." One morning, the Browns were in the middle of breakfast when Mrs. Brown suddenly let out a cry. "Good gracious, I've just remembered it's Mr. Curry's birthday today." "Mr. Curry's birthday?"
I didn't know Mr. Curry had birthdays.
"Everyone has birthdays," said Judy. "Even Mr. Curry."
I don't suppose the postman will be overworked. I can't imagine there being many cards.
The Browns fell silent at the thought. "It's really rather sad," said Mrs. Brown. "I know he brings it on himself by being so bad-tempered, but we ought to do something for him." "Perhaps," said Paddington hopefully, "I could bake him a special birthday cake." "Not in my kitchen oven, you don't," said Mrs. Bird. "It's only just been cleaned. You can have some ingredients, if you like, but no cooking." "Thank you very much, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington doubtfully. It was very nice being offered some ingredients, but he couldn't picture Mr. Curry being very excited by a cold cake. On the other hand, an idea began to form in the back of his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more excited he became, until by the time Mrs. Bird went out shopping later that morning, he could hardly contain himself. Mr. Brown had an old field oven in his garage. It had once been used for picnics, but that was long ago. Now, it was more of a toolbox than an oven. All the same, Paddington felt that given enough ingredients, he would be able to make a very good cake indeed. But if mixing a cake and getting it into the oven had its problems, getting it out again was sometimes even more difficult. And with a large bowl of icing sugar waiting to be used up, he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do. Mr. Curry gazed down at the cake Paddington had made for him.
"It's very kind of you, Bear," he said. "Very kind indeed."
"It's untouched by hand," said Paddington eagerly. "I did it all by paw."
Yes. Well,
I didn't put any candles on top in case the heat damaged the ceiling.
What's that? What do you mean by that, Bear? Are you suggesting...
Perhaps you'd like to cut the cake, Mr. Curry.
Yeah, all right. But special occasions demand special tools. I brought my best knife along.
Oh, dear, I shouldn't use that if I were you, Mr. Curry.
Nonsense, Bear. Stand back. I know what I'm doing. It can't have set that hard. Hasn't been time. Oh, yeah. Oh, Bear. Look at my knife.
Paddington did warn you. Whatever did you make the icing with? Well, said Paddington, it's not so much what it's made with, Mrs. Bird, it's what it's on. I couldn't get the cake out of the oven, so I decided to leave it inside instead. It's what's known as a door cake. It saves having a cake tin, and it stays fresh for ages, if you give it half a chance. One day, the Browns decided to go for a picnic on the river. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a nice, sunny day, and they hadn't been on an outing for a long time. Mr. Brown put Paddington in charge of the pole, and after announcing there would be a competition with a prize for whoever caught the first fish of the day, he gave the signal to move off.
Right, cast off. Anchors away.
"Do what, Mr. Brown?" called Paddington. "Dad means we're ready to go." "Put the pole in the water and push," called Judy. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I'm sure something awful's about to happen." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown," said Paddington. "Bears are good at punting." "Oh."
Help! Help! Help!
"Mercy me," cried Mrs. Bird. "Don't worry about the gramophone, Henry. Do something."
How can I? Paddington's got the pole.
"It's all right. Somebody's coming to the rescue. They're grabbing hold of him now." "He'll be most upset. He had a special bath before he came out. We'd best be using my sunshade as a paddle."
The thing is, said a man, who's going to be the first to give him the kiss of life? Don't all move at once. If you ask me, we ought to try artificial respiration first.
"Artificial respiration?" exclaimed Paddington hotly.
I'd rather have the real thing. I'm sure Mr. Brown won't mind paying for it. Oh, help! I told you not to sit up. Now you've had a relapse.
"I haven't had a relapse," exclaimed Paddington. "I've lost my hat."
Well, if that's the worst that ever happens to you...
Paddington gave the man a hard stare. "That hat's been handed down," he exclaimed. "It was given to me by my uncle in darkest Peru. There isn't another one like it in the world."
Darkest Peru. Perhaps it's sunk. Or got swept over the weir. I wouldn't mind betting it's got swept over the weir. If you ask me, it's a matter for the lock-keeper.
"It might be too late. It might have got sucked into a whirlpool." "My hat sucked into a whirlpool?" repeated Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. "Don't worry, Paddington. We're here. Jump on board. We'll take you to the lock-keeper. He'll help if anyone can." Paddington considered the matter for a moment or two. "I think," he announced at last, "I shall walk, if you don't mind. It's a lot safer, and I can dry out on the way."
"I knew he'd be upset," said Mrs. Bird. "Having 2 baths in one day, when there isn't an hour in the month, is too much for any bear.
Especially Paddington."
"A hat," said the lock-keeper. "Is that what it is? I thought perhaps it was some kind of a bomb. That's why I fished it out and shoved it in a bucket. I thought it might blow up me weir.
You can tell it's a hat because it's got a marmalade sandwich inside. At least what's left of one. Paddington peered inside the bucket in the hope of finding some remains, and as he did so, he nearly fell over backwards with surprise. "Guess what, Mr. Brown?" he exclaimed. "I think I've won the prize for the first catch of the day. Look!"
Good heavens, exclaimed Mr. Brown. Do you see what I can see?
"You just can't compete," said Jonathan. "And he's got a free hat wash into the bargain." "I expect," said Mrs. Bird, "they were after your sandwich. Fish like bread." "Perhaps," said Paddington. "I won't have any 11s after all. I shall save myself for 12. I don't want to spoil my picnic. Picnics make you hungry. Especially when you have them out of doors." One of the things Paddington liked most about living with the Brown family was their garden. It had a lawn, a small fish pond, and several flower beds, not to mention a vegetable patch. In fact, it was almost too big, and Mr. Brown had a hard job keeping it all neat and tidy. One day, Mrs. Brown had an idea. "We'll have a competition," she said. "Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington can each have a patch, and you can award a prize to the best one."
Said Mr. Brown. "Have you ever seen Paddington's efforts at gardening?"
But Paddington thought it was a very good idea. He bought himself several packets of seeds in the market, and after borrowing a book on the subject from Mr. Gruber, he sat up in bed late that night making his plans. Some of the smaller seeds were difficult to handle, especially with paws, and a lot of them got lost in his fur when he tried to count them, which made him feel itchy. So he tried reading the book instead. Mr. Gruber's book was called Gardening the Easy Way by Adrian Crisp. And if the pictures were anything to go by, the book certainly lived up to its title, for Mr. Crisp seemed to spend most of his time sitting in a deck chair, taking a long view of things before he actually set to work. It was all very interesting, and Paddington soon fell asleep. Early next morning, armed with a large jar of marmalade and a pair of opera glasses, Paddington set off towards a nearby building site so that he could take a long view of the Browns' garden.
"Right," said the foreman. "All hands on deck. There's a young bear, gentlemen, here, what's lost some very valuable chunks in our concrete, and I want it sorted out before it sets hard."
"Oh dear," said Paddington, addressing the world in general as the men set to work. "I hope I'm not going to be in trouble again." He tried peering at the view through the wrong end of the glasses in the hope that it might go away. But if anything, it seemed to get worse.
Marmalade chunks?
Repeated the foreman, as Paddington explained matters.
Do you mean to say we've been looking for marmalade chunks? I thought you said they were valuable.
If you're a bear, said Paddington, and haven't got much, marmalade chunks are very valuable.
Well, so's concrete when you're a builder. And look what's happened to ours. All wasted. I wouldn't give you tuppence for it now.
I would, said Paddington excitedly as an idea came into his mind. I've got tuppence left over from my seed money, and I'll see your concrete isn't wasted.
What a good idea, making a rock garden, said Mr. Brown, as he gave Paddington a jar of his special marmalade for having the best patch.
However did you get the idea? Asked Judy. Well, said Paddington truthfully, it came to me out of the sky. It isn't so much a rock garden, it's more of a chunks garden. And with that, he added his special paw mark, just to show it was genuine. One morning, Paddington was pottering about in the garden when he happened to glance through a knothole in Mr. Curry's fence. As he did so, he nearly fell over backwards with surprise at the sight which met his gaze. He'd never seen anything quite like it before. It seemed to be a cross between a very large hair net, which had been hung out to dry, and some extra-large knitting, which had gone wrong. It was all very strange, and he was about to go indoors and tell Mrs. Bird all about it when he had his second shock of the morning.
Bear, what are you doing, Bear? Are you spying on me?
Oh, no, Mr. Curry, gasped Paddington. I wouldn't do that. I was only trying to see what was going on.
Haven't you ever come across a hammock before, Bear? Sailors used to sleep in them at one time. Nowadays, people have them in their gardens.
I don't think I've ever seen a bed with holes in before, Mr. Curry. Is it safe?
Safe? Why, of course it's safe.
Oh, I didn't mean it wasn't a good one, Mr. Curry. It looked rather old. I mean, have you had it a long time?
Well,
For some reason, Mr. Curry seemed anxious to change the subject.
How much do you weigh, Bear?
Paddington considered the matter for a moment. It depends on how many marmalade sandwiches I've eaten, Mr. Curry. Mrs. Bird says I must weigh quite a lot sometimes.
Look, Bear, I'm going upstairs for a book. I shall only be gone 5 minutes, and while I'm away, you can test my hammock for me, just to make sure it's safe and comfortable. If you do it properly, I may let you have a go later on, after I've finished with it for the day.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. I shall look forward to that. If Paddington had never seen a hammock before, he had even less idea how to get into one. And he soon began to wish Mr. Curry had left him a book of instructions.
doing, Bear? Get down off there at once.
Oh, dear. Hello, Mr. Curry.
Bear! What have you done to my hammock? Come back, Bear!
But Paddington had already disappeared. He'd had quite enough of hammocks for one day.
His hammock?
Snorted Mrs. Bird when Paddington told the others about his adventures with Mr. Curry.
The shake of it! I put that hammock out for the dustmen only yesterday.
It's been up in the loft for years. It had gone all rotten.
Mr. Curry must have taken it before the dustmen arrived. He ought to think himself lucky he didn't go through it.
Perhaps, said Paddington hopefully, I could sew some holes together and make you a new one.
There's no need.
Daddy's bought a new one. Look, it's got a special stand, so it'll be much easier to get into and much safer when you're in.
If you like, Paddington, you can be the very first to test it.
No, thank you, Mr. Brown, said Paddington politely. After you. In fact, after everyone. One morning, Paddington arrived at Mr. Gruber's antique shop for his elevenses and found to his surprise that his friend had put the shutters up. He'd only just got over that shock when he had yet another one. Boom! It was all very unexpected, and he couldn't make head or tail of it.
Don't worry, Mr. Brown,
came Mr. Gruber's voice.
We didn't mean to alarm you. It's such nice weather, I thought I would take a day off. I'm taking you all on an outing to the Tower of London.
We're going to see the crown jewels and the beefeaters.
They're really yeoman warders, but I understand they are called beefeaters because in the old days they used to taste all the royal food to make sure it was safe.
Paddington licked his lips while he considered the matter.
I think seeing a beefeater sounds even nicer than having elevenses, Mr. Gruber, he announced at last.
Paddington had never seen a beefeater before, and as soon as they arrived at the tower, he hurried up to one and politely raised his hat. "Would you like one of my marmalade sandwiches?" he asked. "I expect it'll make a nice change from beef." "Oh, gosh," groaned Judy. "Here we go again."
A marmalade sandwich?
The yeoman stared at the object as if he could hardly believe his eyes. Then he looked down, but Paddington was already on his way. He hadn't liked the expression on the man's face at all, and he hurried to join the others.
"This is where they keep the ravens, Mr. Brown. They do say that if they ever fly away, then the tower will fall down."
Paddington peered anxiously at the empty cage. "Perhaps we'd better go, Mr. Gruber," he said. "I shouldn't worry, Paddington. They keep their wings clipped and they let them out during the day. Look, there's one over there." "He looks as if he's got his eye on Paddington," said Jonathan. But the ravens were soon forgotten when Mr. Gruber took them into a very special part of the tower where the crown jewels were kept. Paddington had never seen anything like them before.
"That crown has over 400 stones, said Mr. Gruber, "and it weighs nearly 5 pounds. It's worth a fortune."
"I can see why the Queen doesn't want the tower to fall down," exclaimed Paddington. And as soon as Mr. Gruber had finished his explanations, he hurried outside in order to make sure the raven was still there. To his surprise, there were now 2 birds, and he gave them both a hard stare. As if by magic, 2 more arrived. Paddington turned round and round 3 times just to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and when he looked again, there were 8 birds, all in a row. "There must be something about you," said Judy. "Perhaps it's the colour of your hat." Paddington took a firm grip of his suitcase. He didn't like the way things were going at all. "I think I shall go for my elevenses," he announced, "outside the tower." Paddington felt sure that if the ravens had had their wings clipped, they wouldn't be able to follow him. But he was wrong, for as he came through the arch, the beefeater called out to him,
"Where do you think you're going with our ravens, young fella me bear? Look, they're all following you. We can't have that and risk having the place fall down. I'm afraid you'll have to stay here until we've decided what's best."
Gosh, fancy Paddington being sent to the tower.
Wait a minute. Do you know what I think the trouble is? I think they're after young Mr. Brown's marmalade sandwiches.
And sure enough, after Paddington had given the birds his sandwiches, they stayed happily where they were.
"Well," said the beefeater, "I never knew ravens like marmalade sandwiches. I think perhaps you'd better leave us your address. Then if any of our birds get lost, we can send for you."
"I think," said Paddington, "if I'm to be a marmalade eater, I'd better start work now, just to make sure." One morning, Paddington paid a visit to his local bank in order to withdraw his savings. It had to do with a surprise outing to the seaside, which Mr. Brown had told them about the previous evening. Mrs. Bird had opened an account for him earlier in the year, and although he'd often given the premises some hard stares when he'd gone past, he'd never actually been inside before, let alone drawn anything out. A trip to the seaside sounded a very good excuse indeed. "I would like to withdraw all my savings, please," he announced, "with interest." "With interest?" repeated the clerk. "Oh, dear. Are you expecting a rainy day?" "I hope not," exclaimed Paddington. "We are going to the seaside." "Yeah, quite. May I see your bank book, please, sir?" "Thank you. Yuck! It's all sticky." "I'm afraid I had an accident when I was doing my accounts under the bedclothes last night," said Paddington. "Doing your accounts under the bedclothes?" "Bears always do their accounts under the bedclothes," said Paddington firmly. "I was working out my interest and put my paw in a jar of marmalade by mistake." "Ugh! It hardly seems worth getting in such a mess for the sake of tuppence." "Tuppence?" exclaimed Paddington. "I don't think that's very interesting." "You only had £1 to start with," said the clerk. "Interest has to do with how long you leave your money with us." "Well, mine's been with you since Christmas." "Tuppence. That makes £1 and 2 pence in all. Perhaps you'd like to count it." Paddington needed no second bidding. He was beginning to have a nasty feeling about banks. And a moment later, his worst fears were confirmed. "This isn't my note," he exclaimed hotly. "It's got a different number on it." "A different number? You can't expect to get back the same note you put in. Yours is probably worn out by now. I dare say it's been burnt." "Burnt? You've burnt my note?" "I didn't say it had been burnt. I only said it might have been. Oh, come back." As Paddington hurried into the street, there was a look in his eye that boded ill for anyone who got in his way. Mrs. Bird had often drummed into him what to do in case of an emergency, and he couldn't remember ever having had quite such an emergency before.
"What I would like to know," said a policeman later that morning, "is how anyone can manage to call the police, the fire brigade, and an ambulance all at the same time." Jonathan and Judy exchanged glances. "You do ask people to dial 999 if they see anything suspicious. And burning pound notes must seem very suspicious to a bear." "I'm afraid I got my paw stuck in the dial. Every time I called help, they put me on to someone else." "That's when he called us," said Judy. "Got paw stuck in dial," I don't know what the super will say about this.
Never mind, Paddington, said Judy. At least you've got your tuppence interest. Paddington shook his head sadly. I haven't even got that, he said. I used it when I phoned you just now.
Well, in the circumstances, I'm sure Floyd's will refund it for you, and you can keep your account open. And I'll make sure you get a nice new £1 note for your outing tomorrow.
Paddington considered the matter for a moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Floyd, he said at last, but I think I'll keep my tuppence as well. You never know. If I have trouble with my new note, I may want to call the fire brigade again.
Miles from anywhere, said Mr. Brown gloomily, and not a station in sight. I wonder what's up now.
I'm hungry. Me too, starving. The Browns' trip to the seaside hadn't got off to a very good start. Having risen early, they found themselves in a train which seemed more intent on stopping than actually going anywhere. Paddington, in particular, was feeling most upset. In fact, all in all, what with the delays and the restaurant car being full up with impatient travellers, he was glad he kept a marmalade sandwich under his hat in case of an emergency. It was definitely one of the worst emergencies he could remember. Would you like a nibble, Mr. Brown? He asked. I made it in bed last night.
No, thank you, Paddington. I'll wait till we get there.
Perhaps I'll go and watch the people in the restaurant car, said Paddington. It'll help to pass the time. Be careful and don't get in the way. You don't want soup all down your duffel coat. But her words were lost as the train got underway at last. In any case, Paddington had his mind on other things. Mr. Brown had promised them lunch on the train, and he'd been looking forward to it as much as the train ride. He'd never eaten on a train before, and the thought of having the two together had been beyond his wildest dreams. As he drew level with the kitchen, Paddington suddenly paused. It was like peering into a different world. A world of clanking pots and sizzling pans and people hard at work as the train rocked on its way. Even as he watched, a waiter came dashing in from the restaurant and deposited a pile of dirty plates right in front of him. It was as he was removing some gravy from his eye that Paddington suddenly overheard a snatch of conversation from the kitchen.
Don't take any more orders for the fish. It's off. I'm not surprised. It's one of them days. Everybody's been asking for it. Some days it's all meat, other days it's fish. Good job I stepped on it. Otherwise, some of them would have been unlucky.
Paddington felt pleased he hadn't been eating in the dining car after all. He was a bear with a strong sense of right and wrong, and after directing a very hard stare indeed towards the kitchen, he decided to do something about the matter without further ado. Excuse me, he announced. I shouldn't eat that fish if I were you. It's off.
Off? Doesn't smell too bad to me. At least, what do you think, Muriel?
I heard the chef tell one of the waiters. They've run out of fish, so he had to step on it.
The chef's stepped on it?
I expect he wanted to make it go further, said Paddington.
Disgusting,
called a man at another table.
Couldn't help overhearing what you said, Bear, and I must congratulate you. Smart bit of work.
That's all right, said Paddington doubtfully.
It's more than all right. We might have been poisoned. Chef actually jumped up and down on it, so I hear,
added a third man.
Ground it in with his heels.
I'm going, said his companion, and I shan't leave a tip. I shall give it to that bear. I think he deserves it. It's a pity there aren't more about like him. The rest of what the lady had been going to say was lost in a roar of general agreement, and a tinkle of coins as everyone rose to their feet. Paddington gazed in astonishment. He'd never seen a restaurant empty so quickly. He hesitated for a moment as he peered at all the money on the table, then decided to be on the safe side and leave it for the waiter. One way and another, there wasn't a moment to be lost. Paddington wasn't quite sure what had happened. But as he went past the kitchen, he noticed a very interesting smell of roast beef. And he was anxious to tell the Browns the good news. "Luncheon," he announced in his best waiter's manner, "is about to be served. But if I were you, I'd step on it, otherwise the chef might get there first." Paddington had never been to the seaside before, and he felt very excited. As soon as they reached the promenade, he jumped out of the taxi and hurried across to the railings in order not to lose a second. "The sea looks a long way away," he announced. "I expect the tide's out," shouted Judy. "Out?" exclaimed Paddington. "After we've come all this way?" "Don't worry, it comes in twice a day." Paddington looked better pleased. Having 2 tides a day seemed very good value, and he was about to take another look through his glasses when he heard someone speaking to him.
Excuse me, sir, but I couldn't help you overhearing. I wonder if I could take your photograph while you're waiting for the tide to come in."
"Thank you very much," exclaimed Paddington.
"It won't take long. An handsome gentleman like yourself shouldn't go home without a memento of his visit. You can have as many as you like."
"That's very kind of you," said Paddington. "In that case, I'll have 17. Large ones. One for my Aunt Lucy. She lives in the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. One for each of the Browns. One for Mr. Gruber.
17 large ones. My dear sir, just watch the birdie and get ready to say cheese. I'll be right with you."
Paddington licked his lips. The sea air was already beginning to make him feel hungry. "Excuse me," he announced. "I can't see any birds, but I'm ready for my cheese whenever you like."
What do you mean? You're ready for your cheese? How do you expect me to take a picture if you don't stand in front of the camera? Now, I've wasted a plate. In the circumstances, I shall want my money in advance. That'll be £20, please. £20?
"But I thought they were free."
Free? That's a laugh. Come on, let's see the colour of your money.
"But you said there would be a bird to watch," complained Paddington. "And there wasn't."
"Oh, I expect it flew away when it saw your face."
Paddington took a deep breath. "In that case," he said, giving the man one of his hardest stares ever, "I expect it took the £20 in its beak."
Beak? I'll give you beak. All right, you win. That's the last time I has any dealings with bears." "Congratulations. It's a pity there aren't more public-spirited young bears like you about," said a passer-by. "Bears who know what's right and aren't afraid to stick up for themselves."
And to show how pleased he was, the man held up some shiny coins and pointed to a nearby machine.
"I should try that," he said. 4 pictures for 20p.
Paddington needed no second bidding, and after thanking the man, he hurried inside. Even though there still wasn't a bird to watch, or any sign of cheese for that matter, it did sound much better value. Especially when a line of 4 different photographs popped out as if by magic. And after holding them up carefully in order to make sure they really were of him, he hurried off to tell the Browns. "I've had my photograph taken," he announced, 4 times. "Fancy," said Judy, "and we haven't been here 2 minutes."
"That one looks a bit like Napoleon," said Jonathan.
"That one looks like Napoleon going somewhere," said Mrs. Brown. "And that looks like Napoleon coming back again," said Mrs. Bird.
"And that," said Mr. Brown, "looks like a bear who could do with an ice cream to start the day off with."
"I think I like that last picture best of all, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. "I may have that one framed, just to show what a nice time I'm about to have." To mark Paddington's first visit to the seaside, Mr. Brown fitted him out with all the things he might need in an emergency. Paddington wasn't the sort of bear who believed in taking too many chances, so he decided to wear everything at once, just to be on the safe side. Some of the waves had looked quite large through his opera glasses. All the same, there was a nice, exciting smell in the air, and so many different things to do, it was a job to know which to start on first. In the end, he decided to sit down and think the matter over.
Help! That'll be 10 pence, please.
10 pence? Paddington looked most aggrieved. He'd never heard of anyone having to pay 10 pence to sit in a deck chair before, especially one that didn't work.
Don't worry, I'll pay. In fact, we'll have 6, please. You can keep the change. Thank you, sir. At once, sir. Perhaps the young gentleman would like to do some sunbathing. I'll get him a mattress.
I may do some shade bathing, said Paddington firmly. Bears do shade bathing. They get sunstroke easily. That's why Aunt Lucy made me wear a hat.
How about going in for a hairy knees competition? You do all right at that. I know what. We'll have a sandcastle competition. We'll see who can build the best one.
Super! Bags, we start now. Let's all go in different directions. How about it, Paddington? Judy's words fell on deaf ears. Paddington was anxious to test his bucket and spade, and he hurried off without further ado. Don't go too far away, called Mrs. Bird. And watch the tide. But Paddington was already hard at work. He decided that his sandcastle would be the biggest and best that had ever been made. And the pile of sand got larger and larger until he disappeared from view entirely. When at long last Paddington stood back to admire his handiwork, he really felt very pleased with himself. Admittedly, 1 or 2 of the towers could have been straighter, and the drawbridge looked a trifle rickety, but considering it had all been done by Paw, it wasn't at all bad. What with all his hard work, the sunshine, and the sound of the waves breaking on the shore, he was soon fast asleep. Paddington had no idea how long he slept, but when he woke, he found to his surprise that he was lying flat on his back. From somewhere, close at hand, he could hear people talking.
I can see the headline now,
said a voice, strangely like Mr. Brown's. Lone bear crosses Atlantic on deck chair. Hundreds of days without food or water, added another voice, just like Jonathan's. Paddington pinched himself several times to make sure he wasn't still dreaming, and then sat up. Lesson number 1 with sandcastles, said Mr. Brown, is never build them right by the water's edge. Not when the tide's coming in. It's been washed away. Paddington gazed at the spot where he'd been working. My castle's been washed away, he repeated bitterly. It's a good job you weren't washed away with it. You might have been drowned, or ended up in France. The thing is, what do you want to do now? Paddington considered the matter for a moment. I think, he announced, I may sit in my deck chair and wait for the tide to wash my sandcastle back in again.
I don't know if we shall have time for that,
Paddington, said Mr. Brown tactfully.
How about buying some postcards instead?
Paddington thought that was the best idea he'd heard for a long time. He'd seen some very good ones in a shop on the promenade. And later that day, much later, he sent one to his Aunt Lucy at the Home for Retired Bears in Peru. On the front, there was a picture of the very beach he'd been on. And on the back, he wrote, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. Today I built my first sandcastle, but I'm afraid it went out with the tide. Love, Paddington. And before posting it, he added his special paw mark to show that it was genuine.